Chapter 1. The Fracture Begins. The galaxy in the closing years of the 42nd millennium groaned under the weight of unending war. The Great Rift had torn reality asunder, splitting the Imperium in two, while Xenos threats pressed against mankind's borders with renewed fury. Yet for all the external perils that besieged the worlds of the Emperor, none could have predicted that the greatest threat would emerge not from without, but from within. The signs had been there, scattered across a million worlds like fragments of a shattered mirror. On Terra, the high lords of Terra convened in chambers where silence had grown thick with unspoken accusations. Ancient grudges, long buried beneath the necessity of unity, stirred like serpents in the dark. The Lord Commander Solar questioned the ecclesiastic's latest decree. The Master of the Administratum delayed responses to the Fabricator General's requests. Each slight was small, insignificant on its own, yet collectively they formed cracks in the bedrock of imperial governance. Across the galaxy, Space Marine chapters that had fought side by side for centuries began to question each other's methods. The Black Templars whispered that other chapters had grown soft in their interpretation of the Emperor's will. The Imperial Fists argued amongst themselves whether their defensive doctrine had become outdated. Even the noble Ultramarines found their successor chapters divided between those who held fast to the wisdom of Guilliman and those who believed the Codex Astartes required radical revision. The bonds of brotherhood, forged in the crucible of battle, showed hairline fractures that would soon become chasms. In the Immaterium, the four great powers of chaos sensed opportunity in the galaxy's growing discord. Yet even they were not immune to the force that was building. Khorne's endless rage found new targets in the followers of Slaanesh. Nurgle's patient decay clashed with Tzeentch's eternal schemes for change. What had once been a delicate balance of opposition became something far more vicious, far more personal. The great game intensified, and mortal servants on countless worlds began to feel the pull of their patrons' hatred for their erstwhile allies. The Orcs, scattered across their ramshackle empires, felt the familiar itch of violence that preceded a great war. But this time, the bloodlust did not turn outward toward the galaxy's other races. Goth warbosses looked upon their Bad Moon rivals with fresh contempt. The wealth and flash of the yellow-clad clan suddenly seemed not impressive, but insulting. How dare they claim to be proper orcs while spending teeth on fancy gear instead of crumping enemies? The insult demanded satisfaction, and orc satisfaction was always measured in bloodshed. In the pristine worlds of the Tau Empire, Commander Farsight's rebellion had been contained but never eliminated. The Fourth Sphere. Expansion survivors carried within them truths that contradicted everything the ethereal caste taught. Whispers spread through the fire caste academies, quiet conversations in the water caste diplomatic corps, and urgent discussions among earth caste scientists. The greater good, once an unquestionable philosophy, began to fracture along fault lines that had always existed, but never been examined too closely. Deep in tomb worlds across the galaxy, ancient Necron dynasties stirred from their millennia-long slumber, only to find themselves faced with a choice they had not expected to make. The Silent King had returned, claiming authority over all Necron-Ter. Yet many dynasties remembered a time before Sarek's rule, when they had been proud and independent. The biotransference had robbed them of flesh, but had not erased memory. Old resentments, predating even the war in heaven, began to reassert themselves with the cold logic of the undying. The Aeldari, both those who dwelt in the craft worlds and those who haunted the dark city of Comora, felt the stirring of ancient hatred. For 10,000 years, they had coexisted in a state of mutual contempt and, occasional cooperation. The Drukhari despised their craft-world cousins for their restraint and supposed weakness. The Asuryani saw in their dark kin a reminder of everything their race had once been and could become again. The Inari had promised unity, but unity built on compromise rather than victory was no unity at all. Then came the moment when the galaxy's growing tensions reached their breaking point. It began in the galactic core, where the light of the Astronomicon blazed with the fury of the Emperor's will. Scholars would later debate whether the phenomenon originated from within the Golden Throne itself, from some deep warp disturbance, or from the collective psychic pressure of 1 trillion souls stretched to their breaking point. The cause mattered less than the effect. A wave of psychic energy erupted from the galactic center, racing outward at speeds that defied conventional understanding. It was not visible to the naked eye, nor did it register on traditional Auspex arrays. Instead, it struck at something far deeper. The bonds that held civilizations together, the compromises that enabled cooperation, the restraint that prevented old grudges from becoming new wars. On Terra, the wave struck the Imperial Palace like a tide of liquid hate. Lord Castellan Trajan Valoris of the Adeptus Custodes felt it first, his psychically attuned mind registering the disturbance seconds before it reached the Golden Throne. For a brief moment, the Emperor's presence seemed to flicker, and in that flickering, every petty rivalry and suppressed ambition among the High Lords blazed into terrible clarity. Years of accumulated resentment crystallized into unshakable conviction. The Master of the Administratum declared the Ecclesiarchy a threat to proper governance. The Lord Commander Militant announced that the Adeptus Mechanicus had withheld crucial military supplies for the last time. Across the galaxy, the wave spread with inexorable purpose. On Baal, Blood Angel's successors turned upon each other as the red thirst took on new meaning, not just a hunger for blood, but a hunger for the blood of those who had failed to understand what it truly meant to bear the curse of Sanguinius. On Fenris, the Space Wolves remembered old slights from other chapters and found them suddenly unforgivable. On Macraga, Ultramarine's successors split into factions as rigid as the Codex itself, each convinced that they alone understood Guillemon's true intent. In the Eye of Terror and the countless worlds where chaos held sway, the phenomenon manifested as a sudden intensification of factional hatred. Khorne's berserkers, already primed for violence, turned their chainswords on any who bore the marks of Slanesh. The followers of Nurgle, usually content to spread decay at their own patient pace, found themselves disgusted by Tzeentch's endless schemes and manipulation. What had once been rivalry became religious war, fought with all the fury that only true believers could muster. The Astronomicon, that great lighthouse in the warp that guided Imperial ships across the void, began to flicker. Not with the slow dimming of a dying star, but with the rapid, irregular pulse of a heart under stress. Across the galaxy, astropaths collapsed at their stations, their minds suddenly filled not with the Emperor's guiding light, but with visions of brothers turned against brothers, of unity dissolved into chaos, of every faction in the galaxy consuming itself from within. Navigator houses that had plotted courses through the warp for thousands of years found their traditional routes blocked by new storms of psychic turbulence. Ships that had sailed the same trade routes for centuries discovered that their old partnerships had dissolved overnight, as worlds they had once considered allies now viewed them with sudden and inexplicable suspicion. The wave continued its spread, touching every corner of the galaxy. On forge worlds of the Adeptus Mechanicus, tech priests who had worked together for decades began to question each other's adherence to the Omnissiah's will. Orthodox believers clashed with those who embraced innovation. The binary cant of the machine cult filled with accusation and counter-accusation as schism spread from world to world like a virus in the noosphere. In the far reaches of space, where orc empires sprawled across dozens of star systems, war bosses who had united under the promise of a great warg suddenly found their attention turning inward. Clan rivalries that had been set aside in the face of greater challenges reasserted themselves with brutal clarity. Goths declared bad moons to be flash gits what forgot how to fight proper. Blood axes found themselves accused of being too much like Dahumis. Death Skulls discovered that their prized looted gear was seen not as evidence of their prowess, but as proof of their fundamental untrustworthiness. On Tau worlds, where the greater good had once been an unquestionable truth, Firecast commanders began to question orders from the Ethereal Caste. Watercaste diplomats found themselves wondering why their society needed a ruling caste at all. Earthcaste engineers started to ask uncomfortable questions about technological development that the Ethereals had forbidden. The carefully constructed harmony of Tau society began to unravel as each caste remembered grievances that had been suppressed in the name of unity. In tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, Necron dynasties that had slumbered for millions of years awakened to find themselves faced with a choice between submission to the returning Silent King and the assertion of their own ancient authority. Phyrons who had once bowed to Sarek's leadership now questioned why they should do so again. The cold logic of Necron thought, freed from the emotional bonds that might have counseled patience, led inevitably to the same conclusion: competition for resources and territory, resolved through superior force. Even in the Webway and the dark city of Comora, the psychic wave made itself felt. Craftworld Eldari, who had spent millennia practicing restraint and discipline, suddenly found themselves consumed with hatred for their dark cousins. The Drukhari, already dedicated to excess and cruelty, discovered new depths of contempt for those they saw as weak and hypocritical. The ancient wound that had split their race after the fall began to bleed anew, and the prospect of healing seemed more distant than ever. Thus began what would be known, in the few records that would survive the coming years, as the time of internal strife. Not since the Horus heresy had the galaxy witnessed such a complete breakdown of established alliances and hierarchies. Yet this was different from the rebellion of the War Master. Where Horus had sought to replace the Emperor's rule with his own, the phenomenon that swept across the galaxy in those dark days sought no replacement at all. It was pure dissolution, the unraveling of every bond that held civilization together. And as the last echoes of the psychic wave faded into the background noise of the galaxy's endless conflict, the true horror of what had begun became clear. This was not a war that could be won or lost, negotiated or surrendered. This was the galaxy turning its infinite capacity for violence inward upon itself, and there was no force in the material universe or the warp beyond that could stop what had been set in motion. The fracture had begun, and nothing would ever be the same. Chapter 2. The Imperium Tears Apart. The golden throne room of the Imperial Palace had witnessed 10,000 years of compromise, negotiation, and careful political balance. The High Lords of Terra, those 12 individuals who held the reins of humanity's greatest empire, had long understood that their power rested not on personal ambition, but on collective governance. Yet, as the psychic shockwave's effects took hold, those ancient understandings crumbled like parchment touched by flame. Lord Commander Militant Zaphiel stood before the obsidian table that had hosted countless strategic meetings, his scarred hands clenched into fists as he glared at his fellow High Lords. The Fabricator General's representatives had failed to deliver the promised last weapon shipments to 3 separate war zones. Not delayed, not reduced, completely absent. The mechanical excuses offered through binary cant no longer seemed like bureaucratic inefficiency, but deliberate sabotage of the Imperial war effort. The Adeptus Mechanicus has forgotten their oaths, Zaphiel's voice thundered through the chamber. They withhold arms from our soldiers while they pursue their own mysterious projects. This is treason, nothing less. Across the table, Master of the Administratum Voxica met his accusation with cold calculation. Her data slate showed supply requisitions that had been delayed not by Forge World negligence, but by military command's inability to provide proper transportation assets. The Lord Commander Militant demanded munitions for 12 campaigns simultaneously, while refusing to acknowledge the logistical impossibility of his requests. The Imperium's resources were finite, yet the military leadership behaved as though will alone could conjure material from the void. Perhaps, she replied with deliberate precision, the issue lies not with production, but with distribution. The Imperial Navy has requisitioned cargo vessels for urgent strategic redeployment without consulting this council. Ships that should carry supplies instead ferry troops to battles that serve no strategic purpose beyond personal glory. The accusation struck like a last bolt. Fleet Admiral Quaternia, speaking for the absent Lord High Admiral, rose from her seat with the measured grace of one who had commanded void battles across 12 sectors. Her uniform bore the honors of victories that had secured entire systems for the Emperor's rule. To question the Navy's deployment was to question the very foundation of Imperial expansion and defense. The Navy serves the Emperor's will, she declared, her voice carrying the authority of 10,000 years of naval tradition. We do not answer to clerks and administrators who have never stood on a ship's bridge while enemy fire splits the void around them. Our deployments are based on strategic necessity, not bureaucratic convenience. Yet even as the words left her lips, Fleet Admiral Quaternia felt the weight of deeper truth settling upon her shoulders. The Navy had indeed been operating with increasing independence, following ancient prerogatives and emergency protocols that predated the current High Lord configuration. The Indomitus Crusade had necessitated rapid deployment and autonomous decision-making. Those temporary measures had become permanent practice, and permanent practice had become unquestionable doctrine. Lord Ecclesiarch Daedalus watched the exchange with growing unease. The Church of the Emperor had always served as a unifying force within the Imperium, providing spiritual guidance that transcended factional politics. Yet he too felt the stirrings of profound doubt about his colleagues' commitment to the imperial truth. The Administratum's obsession with efficiency had led to reductions in cathedral construction funds. The military's endless appetite for resources had diverted tithes that should have supported missionary work. How could they spread the Emperor's light to benighted worlds if they lacked the ships, the supplies, and the sacred spaces necessary for proper worship? All of you speak of service to the Emperor, Lord Ecclesiarch Daedalus intoned, his words carrying the weight of absolute faith. Yet I see only servants of your own institutions. The Church requires resources to save souls, yet you allocate them for wars that create nothing but corpses and administrative complexity. The other High Lords turned toward him with expressions ranging from surprise to outrage. The ecclesiarchy had always been a partner in governance, not a competitor for resources. Their tithe requirements were modest, their demands reasonable. To hear the Lord Ecclesiarch speak as though the Church's needs superseded military necessity or administrative efficiency struck them as fundamental misunderstanding of imperial priorities. Master of the Astronomicon Wesen, who had remained silent through the escalating argument, finally spoke with the measured authority of one who maintained humanity's most vital psychic beacon. While you debate resource allocation, the astropathic relay network reports increasing communication failures. Forge worlds are not responding to standard queries. Naval fleets are operating without coordinating with sector command. Imperial Guard regiments are requesting contradictory orders from multiple authorities. The revelation should have prompted immediate coordination and crisis response. Instead, it deepened each faction's conviction that the others were undermining Imperial unity. The Lord Commander Militant saw proof that the Adeptus Mechanicus was deliberately disrupting military communications. The Master of the Administratum recognized evidence that military commanders were bypassing proper channels to avoid oversight. The Fleet Admiral interpreted the data as confirmation that Army incompetence was being blamed on naval communication protocols. Thus began the fracture that would split the Imperium, not along planetary or sector lines, but along institutional boundaries that had defined human civilization for millennia. The High Lords of Terra, who had governed as a collective for 10,000 years, found themselves leading separate factions in a civil war that none of them had intended to start. On Mars, the Fabricator General Belisarius Call felt the schism spreading through the ranks of the tech priests like a virus in the noosphere. The binary cant that had once carried unanimous praise for the Omnissiah now crackled with theological dispute. Orthodox tech priests, led by the conservative magi of ancient Forge worlds, declared that innovation beyond approved STC patterns constituted tech heresy. The knowledge gained during the Indomitus Crusade had introduced dangerous concepts that threatened the purity of their mechanical faith. Progressive elements within the Adeptus Mechanicus, emboldened by the successful development of Primaris space marines and new weapon systems, argued that stagnation was the true heresy. The Omnissiah's knowledge was infinite, and to refuse the pursuit of understanding was to reject the machine god's gifts. They pointed to the successes of recent innovations as proof that calculated risk-taking served the Emperor's will better than hidebound tradition. The theological dispute quickly became a practical war as Forge worlds chose sides. Risa declared for orthodox interpretation and ceased all shipments to Mars. Lucius announced support for progressive research and began developing new weapon patterns without Martian approval. Metallica attempted to remain neutral and found itself attacked by both factions as insufficiently committed to proper doctrine. Within weeks, the noosphere networks that had connected Forge worlds across the galaxy became battlegrounds where competing versions of sacred knowledge fought for dominance. Across Imperial space, the Astra Militarum faced the impossible task of maintaining order while receiving contradictory commands from multiple authorities. General Kassan of the Cadian 47th received orders from the Lord Commander Militant to advance against a heretical cult on Proxima Tertius. The same day, the Master of the Administratum countermanded those orders, declaring that the regiment was needed to suppress civil unrest in the Proxima System's capital. Hours later, the local ecclesiarchy demanded military protection for a vital shrine world that faced imminent chaos incursion. Each order came with proper authentication codes and carried the authority of the High Lords of Terra. Yet they were mutually exclusive, physically impossible to execute simultaneously. General Carson had fought through the 13th Black Crusade and served with distinction in the Indomitus Crusade. His loyalty to the Emperor was unquestionable. But which order represented the Emperor's true will? Which authority spoke with legitimate imperial voice? The decision he made to follow the Lord Commander Militant's directive while ignoring the others set a precedent that rippled through Imperial Guard command structures across the galaxy. Military commanders began choosing which High Lords to obey based on their own judgment of strategic necessity. The unified chain of command that had enabled the Imperium to coordinate forces across 1 million worlds fragmented into competing hierarchies that recognized different sources of ultimate authority. On the hive world of Necromunda, Cardinal Bucaris felt the weight of theological crisis settling upon his shoulders like a funeral shroud. The Lord Ecclesiarch's latest proclamation declared that the Emperor's divinity required new forms of worship that emphasized mystical contemplation over martial action. The local commissaria, following directives from the Lord Commander Militant, insisted that proper faith was demonstrated through combat readiness and unwavering obedience to military authority. The Adeptus Arbites, operating under Master of the Administratum guidelines, maintained that civil order required religious observance that did not interfere with productive labor quotas. 3 interpretations of the Emperor's will, each backed by legitimate imperial authority, each fundamentally incompatible with the others. Cardinal Bucaris had spent decades preaching that the Emperor's truth was singular and absolute. Now he faced the terrifying possibility that even divine revelation could be corrupted by human interpretation, that the institutions he had trusted to preserve sacred doctrine were themselves sources of theological error. In the Sol system itself, the effects of the expanding schism reached their most dramatic expression as Imperial Navy fleets faced a choice that would have been unthinkable mere weeks before. Admiral Korath, commanding Battlegroup Aurelius, received orders from 3 different sources within hours of each other. Fleet Command directed him to escort a convoy of Forge World supply ships to embattled sectors in Segmentum Solar. The High Lord's direct communique ordered him to blockade those same Forge Worlds until they resumed proper cooperation with Terran authority. The Lord Commander Militant's urgent dispatch commanded him to immediately deploy to support beleaguered army regiments, fighting chaos incursions in the Centaurus systems. The choice Admiral Korath made would echo through Imperial history. He chose to follow the Lord Commander Militant's orders, reasoning that protecting Imperial worlds from chaos superseded political disputes between Terra's leadership. His decision left the supply convoy undefended and the blockade unenforced. Within days, Forge World ships carrying desperately needed munitions fell prey to opportunistic pirates. The Forge Worlds, interpreting the Navy's absence as proof of Terran hostility, declared independence from direct High Lord oversight. Thus began the Second Nova Terra Interregnum, not as a distant rebellion in Segmentum Pacificus, but as the fracturing of imperial unity at its very heart. The High Lords of Terra, who had governed humanity's greatest empire for 10 millennia, now commanded competing factions that viewed each other not as partners, but as obstacles to the Emperor's true will. The Golden Throne Room, where compromises had once preserved the Imperium's unity, became a battlefield where bureaucracy and dogma served as weapons in a civil war that would consume worlds and shatter the foundations of human civilization. The Imperium of Man, which had survived the Horus heresy, the age of apostasy, and countless external threats, began to tear itself apart from within. And across the galaxy, the other great powers watched with a mixture of opportunity and horror as humanity's greatest strength, its unity under the Emperor's banner, became the source of its potential destruction. Chapter 3. Space Marines. Against Space Marines. In the 10,000 years since the Horus heresy, the Space Marines had stood as the Emperor's finest warriors, united by bonds of brotherhood that transcended planetary origin, genetic lineage, and tactical doctrine. They were the Adeptus Astartes, the Angels of Death, humanity's greatest champions against the darkness that threatened to consume the galaxy. Yet even they were not immune to the psychic contagion that had begun to tear apart the Imperium from within. Brother Captain Artemis of the Imperial Fists stood upon the ramparts of the fortress monastery on Necromunda's upper spire, watching the vox traffic between his chapter's successor chapters with growing unease. The communications that had once carried reports of shared victories and coordinated campaigns now crackled with accusations and theological disputes. The Crimson Fists questioned the Imperial Fists' commitment to aggressive expansion. The Iron Warrior's successors that had remained loyal after the heresy demanded to know why defensive doctrine had become dogma rather than tactical flexibility. The irony was not lost on him. Rogel Dawn had built the Emperor's palace defenses, had stood as the stalwart defender of Terra during the darkest days of the siege. Yet his sons now found themselves divided between those who saw defense as the highest calling and those who believed that victory required taking the fight to the enemy. What had once been tactical discussion had become ideological warfare, with each side convinced that the others had fundamentally misunderstood their Primarch's legacy. On Fenris, the Space Wolves faced a different but equally bitter division. Logan Grimnar, the Great Wolf, felt the weight of ancient grudges pressing upon him like the crushing depths of an ice-bound sea. The months of shame, when his chapter had defied the Grey Knights and the Inquisition over the fate of Imperial Guard survivors from Armageddon, had established a precedent of resistance to Imperial authority when it conflicted with the Space Wolves' sense of honor and justice. Now, as reports reached Fenris of Grey Knights operating without oversight, of Inquisition forces requisitioning resources meant for Space Marine chapters, those old wounds reopened with fresh fury. The Grey Knights claimed authority to judge the purity of other Astartes, to determine which battles were worthy of Space Marine intervention. The Space Wolves, sons of Leman Russ, acknowledged no authority save the Emperor himself and their own understanding of what honor demanded. Brother Captain Ragnar Blackman led the faction within the chapter that demanded immediate action against what they saw as Grey Knight overreach. The Demon Hunters had overstepped their bounds once too often, treating loyal Space Marines as potential threats rather than brothers in arms. If they would not respect the autonomy that the Space Wolves had earned through 10 millennia of faithful service, then perhaps they needed to be reminded of why the sons of Russ were called the Emperor's executioners. Yet even within the Space Wolves, the fracture spread like poison in the blood. Wolf Lord Ulrich the Slayer counseled patience and careful consideration. The Grey Knights served the Emperor's will in their own way, fighting threats that other Astartes couldn't even comprehend. To turn upon them would be to repeat the mistakes of the heresy, to place pride above duty and personal grievance above imperial unity. The debate that raged in the halls of the Fang carried the weight of more than tactical disagreement. It struck at the heart of what it meant to be a Space Wolf, what loyalty meant when imperial authorities gave contradictory commands, what honor demanded when brotherhood itself became a weapon of division. In the realm of Ultramar, the crisis took on a different character, but carried equal weight. The Ultramarines and their successor chapters had long prided themselves on adherence to the Codex Astartes, the sacred text that Robauta Guilliman himself had written to govern Space Marine organization and tactics. Yet Guilliman's return during the Indomitus Crusade had brought changes that challenged traditional interpretations of his own work. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines found himself caught between competing versions of his Primarch's will. The Codex Astartes, as written, demanded strict adherence to established doctrine and organization. Yet Guilliman himself had authorized deviations, had approved new tactics and technologies that violated the literal text of his own creation, which represented the true legacy of the Primarch, the written word that had guided the chapter for 10,000 years, or the living will of the author who had returned to revise his own work. The Mortifactors, one of the more distant ultramarine successor chapters, declared that any deviation from the original codex constituted heresy against Guilliman's wisdom. Their chapter master, Mordian Vex, had spent decades studying every passage, every tactical diagram, every organizational chart contained within the sacred text. To suggest that the Primarch himself could improve upon perfection was to imply that the codex had been flawed from its inception, a notion that struck at the foundation of everything the Ultramarines represented. Other successor chapters embraced Guilliman's innovations with the fervor of true believers finally hearing their God speak again. The Genesis chapter began implementing new squad organizations. The Patriarchs of Ulixis adopted combat doctrines that emphasized flexibility over adherence to written protocol. They argued that blind obedience to ancient text ignored the living wisdom of their Primarch, that true loyalty meant following Guilliman's intent rather than his historical words. The theological dispute became a practical war when the Mortifactors refused to coordinate with chapters that had corrupted the Codex's teachings. Supply requests were denied. Joint operations were cancelled. What had begun as doctrinal disagreement escalated into active hostility, as each side became convinced that the others had fundamentally betrayed their Primarch's legacy. Yet it was among the Blood Angels and their successor chapters that the fracture reached its most tragic expression. The sons of Sanguinius had long struggled with the dual curse of the Red Thirst and the Black Rage, genetic flaws that made them simultaneously angels and monsters. For 10,000 years, they had supported each other through the darkness, sharing knowledge and techniques that helped them manage their affliction with honor intact. Brother Captain Dante of the Blood Angels felt the weight of millennia pressing upon him as reports reached Baal of successor chapters turning upon each other in savage fury. The flesh-tearers had accused the Lamenters of weakness in their struggle against the Red Thirst. The blood-drinkers declared that the Angels' vermilion had given in too completely to their bloodlust, becoming no better than the monsters they fought. Each accusation carried the terrible weight of potential truth, for all of Sanguinius's sons walked the razor's edge between nobility and damnation. Chapter Master Seth of the Flesh. Tearers led those who believed that embracing the rage was the path to strength. They were weapons of the Emperor, crafted for violence and perfected through bloodshed. To deny their nature was to deny their effectiveness. Better to be honest monsters in service of humanity than to pretend to an angelic nature that had died with their Primarch on the walls of the Emperor's palace. The Lamenters, cursed with misfortune, but blessed with an unusual degree of control over their genetic flaws, represented the opposite philosophy. They maintained that the Red Thirst could be mastered through discipline and brotherhood, that their true strength lay not in embracing their monstrous nature, but in transcending it. To become beasts was to fail Sanguinius's memory, to prove that his sacrifice had been meaningless. The philosophical divide became literal warfare when flesh-tearers' forces intercepted a Lamenter's convoy carrying gene seed to a successor chapter recruitment world. Seth's warriors, convinced that the Lamenter's weak gene seed would compromise the new recruit's ability to serve the Emperor effectively, attacked without warning. The battle that followed was brief but savage, brother fighting brother with a fury that made even veterans of the Long War step back in horror. Yet even as the Space Marine chapters tore themselves apart, the most bitter conflict emerged from an unexpected source. The Black Templars, who had never fully embraced the Codex Astartes and had maintained their crusading traditions, since the second founding, declared themselves the arbiters of proper imperial faith. High Marshal Helbrecht's successors proclaimed that other chapters had grown soft in their devotion to the emperor, that their willingness to cooperate with civilian authorities and Zeno's allies proved their corruption. The Black Templars' accusation struck at every chapter that had fought alongside Imperial Guard regiments, that had coordinated with Adeptus Mechanicus forces, that had participated in the alliances of convenience that had become necessary for Imperial survival. By their interpretation, the Ultramarines' political cooperation with planetary governors constituted weakness. The Salamanders' protection of civilian populations showed misplaced priorities. The Raven Guard's subtle tactics demonstrated cowardice rather than effectiveness. Castellan Grimaldus, leading the Black Templars' most militant faction, declared a new crusade, not against the enemies of humanity, but against the corruption that had infected the Adeptus Astartes themselves. They would purify their brother chapters through force if necessary, burning away the weakness that had allowed compromise and cooperation to replace pure faith and righteous fury. The response from other chapters was swift and unified in its condemnation, yet divided in its proposed solution. Some called for sanctions against the Black Templars, for formal censure that would isolate them until they returned to proper cooperation with their brother chapters. Others demanded immediate military action, arguing that the Black Templars' extremism posed a direct threat to imperial unity that could not be tolerated. Thus began the fratricidal wars that would consume the Adeptus Astartes, turning the Emperor's finest warriors against each other in conflicts that served no strategic purpose beyond the resolution of ancient grievances and incompatible interpretations of duty. The Space Marines, who had stood as humanity's shield against the darkness, became sources of that darkness themselves. Brother Captain Artemis watched from his fortress walls as Imperial Fist's forces clashed with their own successor chapters in the space above Necromunda. The battle barge Inviolate Defiance exchanged fire with the strike cruiser Crimson Determination, each ship crewed by warriors who had once called each other brother. The irony was bitter beyond description. Rogel Dawn's sons, the builders of fortifications, had built walls between themselves that no siege could breach. The Vox channels that had once carried coordination and support now crackled with challenges and ultimatums. Ancient oaths of brotherhood were forgotten in favor of newer loyalties to competing interpretations of Primarch wisdom. The bonds that had united the Adeptus Astartes for 10 millennia proved as fragile as any mortal alliance when subjected to the pressure of absolute certainty about incompatible truths. And across the galaxy, the enemies of humanity watched with growing confidence as the Emperor's champions consumed themselves in civil war, leaving the Imperium's borders defended not by unified purpose, but by fractured remnants of once mighty chapters too busy fighting each other to notice the darkness closing in around them all. The Adeptus Astartes, the angels of death, had become angels of division, and the galaxy burned a little brighter for the loss of their unity. Chapter 4. The four gods turn inward, in the eye of terror, where reality bent to the will of the dark gods, and madness served as the fundamental law of existence. The eternal conflict between the Chaos powers took on a new and terrible intensity. For 10,000 years, the four great powers had waged their great game, competing for dominance while united in their hatred of order and sanity. Yet the psychic shockwave that had torn through the galaxy brought with it something unprecedented: the transformation of cosmic rivalry into mortal war. Khan the Betrayer stood upon the brass ramparts of a fortress that existed in 8 dimensions simultaneously, watching the armies of Slanesh advance across the demon-haunted plain below. The world eaters around him snarled with anticipation, their chain axes hungry for the blood of those who served the Prince of Pleasure. For millennia, they had fought alongside the Emperor's children in campaigns against the Imperium, their fury complementing the enemy's pursuit of sensation and excess. Now, that alliance had become anathema. They mock the purity of rage. Khan's voice rumbled through his helmet's vox grill, each word dripping with contempt. They dilute the sacred fury with sensation-seeking and aesthetic pretension. They are not warriors but performers, not killers but artists of decadence. The accusation carried weight that resonated through the warp itself. Khorne's hatred for Slaanesh was fundamental, written into the very fabric of their opposing natures. The blood god's rage was pure, focused, devoted entirely to the act of killing and the spilling of blood. Slaanesh's pursuit of sensation and perfection seemed to him the worst kind of corruption, violence tainted by complexity, killing made into art rather than worship. Below them, the Emperor's children advanced in formations that were as beautiful as they were deadly. Their armor gleamed with perfect polish, their weapons sang with harmonious frequencies, their movements flowed with the grace of dancers performing for an appreciative audience. At their head marched Lord Commander Eidolon, his enhanced vocal cords producing sonic frequencies that could shatter steel and minds alike. Yet to the World Eaters, this display of perfection was evidence of fundamental corruption. True warriors did not concern themselves with beauty or harmony. True servants of Khorne killed not for sensation, but for the glory of the kill itself, for the sacred act of offering blood to the throne of skulls. The Emperor's children had forgotten this truth, had allowed their patron's obsession with perfection to contaminate the pure act of violence. The battle that followed was not the coordinated assault against Imperial forces that had characterized previous campaigns. Instead, it became a theological war fought with chain sword and sonic weapon, each side convinced that the other represented a fundamental misunderstanding of what chaos truly meant. World Eaters tore through Emperor's children formations with berserker fury, seeking to purify the act of killing from aesthetic consideration. Emperor's children responded with tactics of perfect brutality, demonstrating that beauty and lethality were not opposing forces, but complementary aspects of the same truth. In another sector of the Eye, where the Garden of Nurgle spread its diseased bounty across countless worlds, a different but equally bitter conflict erupted between the servants of decay and the disciples of change. Typhus, herald of Nurgle, felt the weight of cosmic contradiction pressing upon his rotting consciousness as he observed thousand-sun sorcerers attempting to improve the perfect stagnation of his plague ships. The sons of Magnus the Red, led by exalted sorcerer Ahriman, had arrived claiming to offer alliance against the growing imperial threat. Yet their presence brought change to systems that had achieved perfect entropy, introducing variables to equations that had reached blessed stability. Their magic sought to transform and evolve, to introduce new possibilities where Nurgle's gifts had established eternal constancy. "You understand nothing," Typhus wheezed through vocal cords thick with centuries of decay. "Perfection lies not in change, but in acceptance. The gifts of Grandfather Nurgle represent the final truth, that all things rot, all things decay, all things return to their essential elements. Your magic fights against this reality instead of embracing it." Ahriman's response crackled with the power of the warp as he gestured toward the plague ships floating in the cosmic winds. Stagnation is the ultimate failure of potential. Every moment that passes without change is a moment wasted, a possibility unexplored. The Changer of Ways teaches us that transformation is the only constant, that evolution is the purpose of existence itself. The philosophical dispute quickly became practical warfare, as Death Guard and Thousand Suns forces clashed on world after world. The sons of Mortarion brought with them the gifts of Nurgle, plagues that reduced their enemies to rotting husks, toxic clouds that transformed battlefields into gardens of decay, diseases that attacked not just flesh, but hope itself. The Thousand Suns responded with sorcery that sought to accelerate evolution beyond the boundaries of physical form, transformations that turned Nurgle's gifts against themselves, changes so rapid and profound that even decay could not keep pace. Yet it was in the realm between realms, where demon princes held court over legions of the damned, that the Chaos Civil War reached its most apocalyptic expression. Be'lakor, the first prince, watched with ancient satisfaction as the great powers turned their fury inward. For millennia, he had served each of the four gods while belonging to none, navigating the great game through careful neutrality and patient manipulation. Now, that neutrality became impossible to maintain. Demon princes, who had served alongside each other in the Long War, found themselves forced to choose sides, as their patron god's hatred intensified beyond mere cosmic rivalry into active animosity. The politics of the warp, which had been stable for 10,000 years, collapsed into open warfare as princes who had once coordinated their efforts began to see each other, not as rivals, but as enemies. Prince Drachnian, bound to Khorne's service through countless battles, declared war upon the demon princes of Slaanesh, who inhabited the same warp-touched sectors. His legions of bloodletters and berserkers fell upon pleasure cults and sensory enhancement laboratories, with the fury of true believers purging heretics. The irony was profound. Servants of chaos, unified in their opposition to order, had become so pure in their devotion to individual aspects of corruption that they could no longer tolerate other forms of darkness. On the demon world of Medrengard, where Perturabo's iron warriors had built fortress cities that defied both physics and sanity, the Civil War took on the character of siege warfare that would have impressed their loyalist cousins. Word-bearers' forces, seeking to spread the worship of chaos undivided, found themselves under assault from iron warriors who had chosen to serve Khorne exclusively. The siege engines that had once been turned against imperial strongholds now targeted daimon fortresses. Lascannon and daimon cannon exchanging fire in battles that served no strategic purpose beyond the resolution of theological differences. Lorgar's sons, led by Dark Apostle Erebus, preached the unity of the four powers even as they fought for their lives against former allies. "We are all children of the warp," Erebus intoned through vox speakers that reached across dimensional barriers. The division of chaos into separate powers is an artificial construct, a limitation imposed by mortal understanding. True enlightenment comes through embracing all aspects of corruption simultaneously. The Iron Warriors' response came in the form of siege artillery that reduced word-bearer positions to rubble, while Warsmith Honso's mechanical voice echoed across the battlefield. Unity is weakness. Devotion divided is devotion diluted. Better to serve one master perfectly than four masters inadequately. Thus began the Chaos Civil War that would rage across the Eye of Terror and every warp-touched sector of the galaxy. Cults that had once coordinated their efforts against imperial targets turned upon each other with the fury of theological conviction. Heretic Astartes chapters that had fought side by side for millennia discovered that their interpretations of chaos worship were fundamentally incompatible, On Sycharis, the demon world that served as the word-bearer's primary stronghold, ancient texts were consulted and reinterpreted as different factions within the Legion itself began to argue over the proper approach to chaos worship. Some maintained that the four gods were aspects of a greater unity that transcended individual devotion. Others argued that true power came from exclusive service to the strongest patron. The debates that had once been theological exercises became literal battles as bolter-fire replaced reasoned argument. The Night Lords, who had never fully embraced any single chaos power, found themselves caught between competing factions that demanded allegiance to specific patrons. Their gene-father Conrad Kurz had sought to inspire fear without bowing to any god, but his sons now faced pressure to choose sides in a war that left no room for neutrality. Terror tactics that had once been unified in purpose became fragmented as different companies aligned with different powers, each convinced that their approach to fear and intimidation represented the only valid path. In the material realm, the effects of the Chaos Civil War manifested as unprecedented opportunities for Imperial forces, if they had been capable of exploiting them. Heretic cults that had once coordinated planetary rebellions found themselves fighting each other instead of Imperial authorities. Chaos space. Marine raids that had terrorized entire sectors were cancelled as different legions turned their attention to settling ancient scores with former allies. Yet the Imperium, consumed by its own civil war, proved incapable of capitalizing on Chaos's sudden disunity. Imperial Guard regiments that should have been reclaiming worlds lost to heretic rebellion were instead fighting each other over conflicting orders from Terra. Space Marine chapters that could have exploited the chaos among their ancient enemies were too busy establishing their own ideological purity through fratricidal conflict. The greatest irony of the Chaos Civil War was that it demonstrated something that loyalist forces had long refused to acknowledge, that even the most unified opposition could be fractured along philosophical lines if those divisions were pushed to their logical conclusion. The servants of the dark gods, who had seemed united in their opposition to order and sanity, proved as vulnerable to ideological schism as any other force in the galaxy. Yet this revelation came too late to benefit anyone. The Imperium's capacity for coordinated response had been shattered by its own internal conflicts. The Chaos powers, despite their disunity, remained individually dangerous enough to threaten entire sectors. The galaxy had not become safer through the fracturing of its greatest threats. It had simply become more chaotic, more unpredictable, more capable of consuming itself through internal strife. And in the deepest reaches of the Eye of Terror, where the four gods maintained their eternal vigil over the great game, new rules were being written for a contest that would consume gods and mortals alike in the pursuit of philosophical purity that allowed no room for compromise or coexistence. The servants of chaos had learned to hate each other with the same fervor they had once reserved for the forces of order, and the galaxy burned a little brighter for their newfound theological precision. Chapter 5. War against war. In the sprawling orc empires that festered across the galaxy's war-torn sectors, where might made right and the strongest war boss commanded absolute obedience, the psychic shockwave manifested not as philosophical division, but as pure, undiluted tribal hatred. The greenskin race had always been fractious, their society built upon the simple principle that bigger was better and violence solved all disputes. Yet for all their constant brawling and clan rivalries, they had remained united by the greater truth that fighting anyone was better than fighting no one at all. Now, that unity shattered like poorly welded scrap metal under the hammer of renewed clan hatred. War boss Scarfang of the Goth clan stood atop his favorite pile of defeated enemies, his massive frame casting shadows across the sprawling camp where his boys prepared for the greatest fight of their lives. The enemy was not some puny human army or pointy-eared Eldar raiding force, but their own kind, greenskins who had forgotten what it meant to be proper orcs. His scarred hands gripped his power claw as he surveyed the weapons and vehicles being readied for war, each one painted in the black and white checks that marked true Goth supremacy. "Look at 'em," Scarfang growled to his knob retinue, gesturing toward the distant camps where rival clans prepared their own forces. "Bad Moons think Teef makes 'em tough. Death Skulls think lootin' makes 'em clever. Blood Axes think actin' like humies makes 'em smart. They forgot the only thing that matters, being the best at crumping." The accusation carried weight that resonated through the simple but unshakable orc understanding of proper behavior. Goths had always prided themselves on being the most orky of all orcs, the purest expression of what their race represented. They painted their vehicles black because black was the toughest color. They fought in close combat because shooting was for those too weak to get their hands dirty. They followed the biggest, strongest war boss, because that was how Gork and Mork intended orc society to work. Yet the other clans had corrupted this simple truth with unnecessary complications. Bad Moons flashed their wealth like it mattered more than fighting prowess. Death Skulls collected garbage like pack animals instead of winning it through conquest. Blood Axes adopted human tactics because they lacked the natural cunning that orcs should possess. Each deviation from proper orciness was an insult to everything the Goths held sacred. Across the blasted wasteland that separated the Goth encampment from their rivals, Flash Git Scarjaw counted the impressive pile of teeth that would fund his clan's response to Goth aggression. The Bad Moons had always been the wealthiest of the orc clans, their naturally fast-growing teeth providing them with the currency needed to purchase the finest weapons and equipment available. Where other clans made do with scavenged gear and improvised weapons, Bad Moons could afford proper dakka, real armor, and the services of the most skilled mech boys in orc space. "Let the Goths come," Scarjaw snarled through his impressive collection of gold teeth. "We got the best shooters, the fastest trucks, and the shiniest gear. When we're done with them, they'll know that teeth talks louder than muscles." The Bad Moons had hired mercenaries from every available source, including several units of Flash Gits, whose loyalty could be purchased with enough teeth and the promise of even better weapons. Their camps gleamed with polished metal and bright yellow paint, each vehicle and weapon maintained to perfection by Gretchen slaves who knew that slovenly appearance meant painful death. They represented the ultimate expression of orc materialism, the belief that superior equipment, properly maintained and extensively customized, would triumph over mere physical strength. Yet their displays of wealth only reinforced Goth conviction that the Bad Moons had lost touch with fundamental orc values. Real orcs didn't buy their victories. They won them through superior fighting spirit and unbreakable determination. The flashy gear and hired guns were evidence of weakness, not strength, proof that Bad Moons could no longer rely on their own abilities to achieve victory. In the scrap metal citadels where Death Skull war bosses planned their response to the growing clan war, a different kind of preparation took place. The blue-painted orcs had built their reputation on acquisition rather than production, salvaging and looting everything from enemy equipment to abandoned Imperial installations. Their camps resembled vast junkyards, where every conceivable piece of technology was collected, sorted, and eventually repurposed into something useful. Big Mech Skarsnag surveyed his collection of looted Imperial vehicles, chaos artifacts, and Tau technology with the satisfaction of a collector who had spent decades perfecting his hoard. The Death Skulls understood that victory came not from rigid adherence to tradition, but from adaptability and resource management. They used whatever worked, regardless of its origin, and had survived countless wars through superior logistics and tactical flexibility. "The overclans don't get it," Skarsnag muttered to his assembled mech boys. "They think there's only one way to be orky. But Gork and Mork gave us brains to figure things out, not just muscles to smash with. We'll show 'em that smart orcs live longer than tough ones." The philosophy that had made Death Skulls successful across countless campaigns now marked them as targets for clan purification. Their willingness to adopt foreign technology and tactics, their pragmatic approach to warfare, and their success through cunning rather than brute force were interpreted by other clans as evidence of fundamental corruption. True orcs, according to Goth ideology, didn't need to steal human ideas or adopt alien weapons. They won through superior orkiness, not through clever adaptation. Yet perhaps the most bitter hatred was reserved for the Blood Axes, whose adoption of human military tactics had long made them suspects in the eyes of more traditional clans. Colonel Skargrax, the most successful Blood Axe war boss in the sector, understood that his clan's survival depended on proving their orkiness through victory rather than through adherence to traditional methods. "We use Humi tactics because they work," Skargrax explained to his assembled nobs, his scarred face grim with the knowledge that their very success had made them targets. "Camouflage, discipline, coordinated attacks. These ain't unorky, they're just smart. But the other clans would rather lose like proper orcs than win like clever ones." The Blood Axes had demonstrated their effectiveness in countless campaigns against Imperial forces, using combined arms tactics and strategic planning that maximized their advantages while minimizing their weaknesses. Their regiments operated with discipline that would have impressed human military observers, maintaining unit cohesion and following complex battle plans that other orc clans dismissed as unnecessarily complicated. Yet this very success had become their greatest liability. Other clans saw Blood Axe victories as evidence that they had abandoned their essential orkiness in favor of foreign concepts like planning, discipline, and tactical coordination. The accusation struck at the heart of what it meant to be an orc, whether success through adaptation was preferable to failure through tradition. The war that erupted between the clans carried an intensity that surprised even the orcs themselves. These were not the ritual combats that had traditionally resolved clan disputes, but total conflicts aimed at proving which interpretation of orkiness deserved to survive. Goth forces attacked Bad Moon convoys with righteous fury, seeking to demonstrate that wealth meant nothing against proper fighting spirit. Bad Moon hired guns responded with concentrated firepower that turned battlefields into killing grounds where superior equipment faced off against superior motivation. Deathskull raiders struck at both factions simultaneously, looting weapons and vehicles from the battlefield to fuel their own war effort. Blood Axe forces used hit-and-run tactics that maximized their advantages while minimizing their exposure to direct confrontation. Each clan's approach to warfare became a statement about the proper way to be an orc, and each victory or defeat was interpreted as proof that their philosophy was correct or fundamentally flawed. The consequences rippled across every orc-controlled world in the sector. Supply lines that had supported massive war campaigns were redirected to support clan warfare. Mech boys who had collaborated on building gigantic war machines found themselves working exclusively for their own clans. Even the Gretchen slaves began choosing sides, aligning themselves with whichever clan seemed most likely to provide protection and advancement. Warboss Scarfang's attempts to unite the clans through personal combat challenges were overwhelmed by the scale of factional hatred that had emerged. Traditional orc methods of dispute resolution, single combat between champions, contests of strength and cunning, or simple displays of superior violence proved inadequate when the disagreement centered on fundamental questions of identity and proper behavior. Some war bosses tried to rise above clan loyalty by appealing to universal orc values. Big Boss Scarjaw of the Evil Suns attempted to organize a grand race where speed would determine which clan deserved leadership. His proposal was rejected by clans that specialized in other forms of combat, each insisting that their particular strength should be the determining factor in any contest for dominance. The futility of such attempts became clear when even the Evil Suns began fragmenting along internal lines. Speed freaks who favored bikes clashed with those who preferred trucks. Pilots of fighter bombers looked down on ground-based racers as inferior. What had seemed like a unified clan revealed itself to be a collection of competing sub-factions, each convinced that their particular interpretation of going fast represented the true Evil Sun's way. Thus began the Great Orc Civil War that would consume entire sectors and reduce the greenskin threat to other factions by orders of magnitude. Worlds that had been staging areas for massive war campaigns became battlegrounds where different interpretations of orciness fought for supremacy. The simple, savage joy that had once united all orcs in common cause became the source of bitter division as each clan sought to prove their superiority through the complete destruction of their rivals. The irony was not lost on those few orc observers capable of understanding it. The very qualities that made orcs dangerous to other races, their love of violence, their tribal identity, their unwavering belief in their own superiority, had become the weapons they used against each other. The fighting spirit that had enabled them to carve out empires across the galaxy now served to tear those empires apart from within. Imperial reconnaissance reports, when they could be delivered through the chaos of human civil war, noted the dramatic reduction in orc pressure along contested fronts. Worlds that had faced imminent greenskin invasion found their attackers recalled to fight clan wars on their own territory. Wah! Fleets that had terrorized entire sectors turned their guns on each other in battles that served no strategic purpose, beyond proving which clan was the most orky. Yet the Imperium, consumed by its own internal conflicts, proved incapable of exploiting this unexpected respite. Space Marine chapters that should have been reclaiming orc-held territory were too busy fighting their own fratricidal wars. Imperial Guard regiments that could have advanced into power vacuums were paralyzed by conflicting orders from competing High Lord factions. The galaxy had not become safer through the fracturing of the orc threat. It had simply become more fragmented, more unpredictable, more capable of consuming itself through conflicts that served no rational purpose. The orcs, who had once been united in their simple love of violence, had learned to hate each other with the same fervor they had once reserved for their external enemies. And in the ruins of what had once been mighty orc strongholds, the green tide that had threatened to drown the galaxy in endless war turned inward upon itself, proving that even the most savage and straightforward race could fall victim to the seductive appeal of ideological purity that allowed no room for compromise or coexistence. Chapter 6. The Tau Empire. Schism. The pristine spires of Daleth Prime gleamed under the light of twin suns, their perfectly engineered surfaces reflecting the harmony and unity that had defined Tau civilization for generations. In the great assembly halls where representatives of the four castes gathered to coordinate the Empire's expansion, the careful balance of cooperation and hierarchy that had enabled unprecedented technological advancement began to show its first cracks under the weight of inconvenient truths. Chazalmayen stood before the towering windows that overlooked the city's geometric perfection, his ceremonial armor bearing the scars of campaigns that had pushed the Empire's borders ever outward in service of the greater good. As a Firecast commander, he had dedicated his life to the principle that all Tau served a common purpose that transcended individual ambition or caste loyalty. Yet the reports reaching Daleth from the Fourth Sphere expansion survivors had begun to shake the foundations of everything he believed. The testimonies were fragmentary, delivered in hushed whispers by fire warriors, whose loyalty to the Empire was unquestionable, but whose experiences had exposed them to truths that contradicted fundamental ethereal teachings. They spoke of Tau settlements discovered in deep space, colonies that had developed without ethereal guidance and had somehow thrived. They described technologies that had been classified as forbidden or impossible, yet clearly functioned without the theoretical limitations that Earth-caste doctrine insisted were absolute. Most disturbing of all, they carried accounts of Tau who had lived entire lives without ever seeing an ethereal, yet displayed none of the chaos and purposelessness that official doctrine claimed would inevitably result from such absence. These communities had maintained social order, technological progress, and even versions of the greater good philosophy that had evolved independently of central guidance. The implications are troubling, Chazalmayen admitted to his assembled advisers, his voice carrying the weight of a loyal servant, confronting the possibility that his loyalty had been based on incomplete information. If these reports are accurate, then fundamental assumptions about Tau nature and necessary governance require re-examination. Poor Elkarion of the Watercast felt the weight of similar revelations settling upon her diplomatic consciousness like a slow-acting poison. Her caste had always served as the interface between Tau society and the wider galaxy, negotiating treaties and alliances that advanced imperial interests while maintaining the careful balance of cooperation that the greater good required. Yet her recent communications with Firecast commanders in distant sectors had revealed patterns of behavior that suggested systematic deception rather than mutual cooperation. The ethereals she had discovered maintained separate communication networks that bypassed normal caste channels. Critical information about alien threats, technological discoveries, and strategic developments was filtered through ethereal oversight before being distributed to the other castes. What she had always assumed was careful coordination to prevent unnecessary alarm or confusion now appeared to be deliberate information control designed to maintain ethereal authority rather than serve imperial efficiency. Her investigation into these communication protocols had uncovered evidence that troubled her deeply. Watercast negotiators had been given incomplete or misleading briefings about imperial capabilities and limitations. Diplomatic initiatives that could have advanced Tau interests had been cancelled without explanation. Most significantly, she had found records of successful alliances with human and even Eldari factions that had been terminated not because they failed to serve the greater good, but because they demonstrated that other castes could achieve significant results without ethereal supervision. In the underground research facilities, where Earth-caste scientists pushed the boundaries of Tau technological understanding, Fioel Shais made discoveries that would have earned him commendation under normal circumstances, but now filled him with profound unease. His research into adaptive technologies had led him to examine historical records of scientific development, searching for patterns that might inform future innovation strategies. What he found challenged everything he had been taught about the natural progression of Tau science. Critical research projects had been classified or terminated not because they were impossible or dangerous, but because they had succeeded too well. Weapons technologies that could have revolutionized Firecast effectiveness had been suppressed. Manufacturing processes that could have dramatically improved imperial logistics had been declared incompatible with proper social development. Most significantly, communication and transportation innovations that could have enabled greater independence for distant colonies had been buried in classified archives. The pattern that emerged suggested systematic technological suppression designed not to protect Tau society from dangerous innovation, but to maintain centralized control over scientific development. The Earth caste, which prided itself on rational inquiry and evidence-based conclusions, had been manipulated into accepting artificial limitations that served political rather than scientific purposes. "We have been building within constraints that do not actually exist," Theo Shais confided to his research team during a clandestine meeting held far from the monitoring devices that had become standard in all official Earth caste facilities. "Our failures to achieve certain technological goals were not due to natural limitations, but to deliberate obstruction disguised as guidance." Across the Empire, similar revelations began to spread through networks that had existed primarily to coordinate caste functions, but now served as conduits for dangerous knowledge. Aircaste pilots discovered that their routes and schedules were designed not for maximum efficiency, but for maintaining ethereal oversight of inter-system communications. Kor-El Vashya, commanding the exploration fleet Montaka's Edge, realized that her orders to avoid certain sectors were based not on navigational hazards, but on the presence of independent Tau settlements that contradicted official expansion narratives. The crisis reached its breaking point when Commander Farsight's formal declaration of independence from the Empire arrived at Daleth through channels that the ethereal hierarchy had believed were completely under their control. The message was broadcast simultaneously across multiple caste networks, carrying detailed explanations of the deceptions that had motivated the Farsight Enclave's original rebellion, and offering support to any Tau who chose to seek truth over comfortable submission to authority. "The greater good," Farsight's voice echoed through communication arrays that had suddenly become tools of rebellion rather than imperial coordination, was never meant to require the suppression of knowledge or the maintenance of artificial limitations on our potential. "We serve the Empire best when we serve the truth, not when we serve the comfort of those who fear what honest inquiry might reveal." The response from the Ethereal Council was swift but revealed the very authoritarian reflexes that Farsight's message had condemned. Communication networks were shut down without explanation, research projects were suspended, pending security reviews. Military units found their orders changed from exploration and expansion to internal monitoring and control. The careful facade of cooperative governance collapsed into open authoritarianism as the Ethereals chose maintaining power over maintaining the principles they claimed to represent. Yet the attempt at suppression came too late to prevent the spread of ideological awakening that Farsight's rebellion had catalyzed. Shazel Mayen found himself contacted by Firecaste commanders across 3 different sectors, each reporting similar patterns of deception and control within their own command structures. Watercaste diplomats began sharing classified information that revealed the extent to which their negotiations had been undermined by ethereal interference. Earth-caste scientists started collaborating across caste boundaries to develop technologies that had been declared impossible or forbidden. Most significantly, air-caste fleets began choosing sides in a conflict that none of them had intended to start. Kor-El Vashya's decision to ignore recall orders and continue her exploration mission was followed by similar acts of defiance from fleet commanders who had discovered that their loyalty to the Empire required disloyalty to its current leadership. The vast transportation network that held the Tau Empire together became the battleground where competing visions of the greater good fought for dominance. The first open battles between Tau forces erupted not over territory or resources, but over access to information. Loyalist aircraft squadrons attempted to prevent rebel ships from reaching systems where Farsight's message had not yet been broadcast. Firecast commanders who had chosen to support the rebellion found themselves fighting former colleagues who remained convinced that ethereal authority represented the only path to Imperial survival. Commander Shadowsun, leading the Loyalist faction, declared that the rebels had been corrupted by exposure to alien influences and no longer represented true Tau values. Her forces moved to secure critical communication hubs and production facilities, arguing that the Empire's survival required the suppression of ideas that threatened its unity. The irony was bitter. The greater good, which had been founded on the principle of cooperation for mutual benefit, had become the justification for civil war between those who interpreted its meaning differently. Yet even among the Loyalists, cracks began to appear as evidence of ethereal deception became impossible to ignore. Watercast negotiators discovered that their own reports had been edited before being transmitted to other castes. Earthcast scientists found research projects restored to active status, only to be terminated again when they began producing inconvenient results. Aircast pilots realized that their communication logs were being monitored and altered without their knowledge. The three-way conflict that emerged was unlike anything in Tau history. The Loyalist Empire, now openly authoritarian in its methods, sought to maintain unity through information control and military suppression. The Farsight enclaves offered an alternative based on transparency and voluntary cooperation rather than hierarchical command. A third faction, composed of moderate reformers, attempted to find a middle path that preserved Imperial unity while addressing the legitimate grievances that had sparked the rebellion. Shazil found himself leading this moderate faction, arguing that the Empire could be reformed without being destroyed. His position attracted support from Tau, who valued both truth and stability, who believed that the greater good could be preserved even if the ethereal interpretation of it was abandoned. Yet his attempts at mediation were frustrated by the growing polarization between loyalists who would tolerate no criticism and rebels who would accept no compromise. The war that consumed the Tau Empire was not fought with the massive armies and devastating weapons that characterized conflicts between different species, but with competing broadcasts, sabotaged communications, and battles for control of information networks. Each side sought to prove that their interpretation of the greater good represented the authentic Tau path, and each victory or defeat was measured not in territory conquered, but in minds convinced. The pristine spires of Daleth Prime, which had once symbolized the harmony and unity that made Tau civilization possible, became fortified positions in a civil war that threatened to destroy everything they represented. The greater good, which had united a species and enabled unprecedented cooperation across caste boundaries, had become the source of bitter division, as different groups claimed exclusive authority to define its meaning. And across the galaxy, other factions watched with interest as another supposedly unified empire tore itself apart from within, proving once again that no civilization, no matter how carefully constructed or rationally governed, was immune to the seductive appeal of ideological purity that allowed no room for compromise or question. The Tau, who had prided themselves on learning from the mistakes of other species, had discovered that the greatest threat to their empire came not from external enemies, but from the contradictions inherent in any system that demanded absolute trust in authority, while claiming to serve absolute truth. Chapter 7. Necron Dynasty Wars. In the depths of tomb worlds, scattered across the galaxy's darkest regions, where ancient machines had slumbered for 60 million years. The first stirrings of dynastic conflict began not with passion or ideology, but with the cold logic of mathematical hatred. The Necrons, who had transcended flesh to achieve immortality through living metal, had believed themselves freed from the emotional weaknesses that plagued organic races. Yet as the psychic shockwave reached even their mechanical consciousness, they discovered that some grudges were older than civilizations, and deeper than death itself. Zarek the Silent King stood upon the command throne of his flagship, the Charnel Throne, watching the awakening of tomb worlds across the Zarekan dynasty's ancient holdings. His return from self-imposed exile in the intergalactic void had been motivated by the discovery of the Tyrannid threat, a devouring swarm that would consume all life in the galaxy, unless the Necron dynasties could be united under his authority. Yet his grand strategy of reunification was crumbling before it could properly begin, undermined not by external enemies, but by the very people he sought to save. The reports reaching his flagship told a story of resistance that defied his expectations. Tomb worlds that should have responded to his awakening protocols with immediate obedience, instead transmitted messages of cold rejection. Pharaons who had once bowed to his authority now questioned why they should submit to a leader who had abandoned them for 60 million years. Most disturbing of all, some dynasties had begun awakening on their own initiative, following their own agendas that took no account of his greater strategic vision. The Mefrit dynasty refuses our coordination protocols, reported Nemesor Altix, his artificial voice carrying none of the emotional inflection that would have marked organic disappointment, but somehow conveying the weight of strategic frustration nonetheless. They claim sovereignty over 17 tomb worlds that our records list as Zarekon holdings. Pharaon Zenek has declared that our absence constitutes abandonment of territorial claims. The accusation struck at the heart of Necron political philosophy, where power was measured not in years or decades, but in geological epochs, and authority derived from continuous presence rather than historical precedent. By choosing exile, Zarek had created a power vacuum that other dynasties had filled according to their own understanding of legitimate succession. His return did not automatically restore his former authority. It created a succession crisis that threatened to tear apart the already fragmented Necron Empire. On the tomb world of Thanatos, Pharaon Zenek reviewed tactical displays that showed Zarekan forces approaching his domain with what their transmissions described as restoration protocols, but which his analysis suggested were preparation for conquest. The Mefrit dynasty had not slumbered through the long night between the war in heaven and the present era. Their tomb complexes had maintained minimal activity, monitoring the galaxy's development and occasionally stirring to eliminate threats to their holdings. During those millions of years, they had expanded their territorial claims, annexed worlds that other dynasties had abandoned or failed to properly defend, and established what they considered legitimate sovereignty over vast regions of space. The Silent King's return challenged not just their independence, but the entire legal framework they had developed to govern interdynastic relations in his absence. We acknowledged Zarek's authority when it was exercised. Pharaon Zenek's transmission echoed across the tomb world's communication networks. We do not acknowledge the authority of absence, nor do we accept that voluntary exile preserves claims that were not maintained through presence. If the Silent King wishes to rule, let him prove his worthiness through the same trials that we have endured. The challenge represented more than territorial dispute. It struck at fundamental questions about the nature of Necron authority and the obligations of leadership. In organic societies, rulers could delegate authority and expect it to be maintained during their absence. In Necron civilization, where immortality made personal presence theoretically unlimited, abandonment of responsibility was seen as abandonment of legitimacy. Yet the dynastic conflicts were complicated by the emergence of ideological divisions that had been dormant during the long sleep. The Destroyer cult, which preached the elimination of all life in the galaxy as the ultimate expression of Necron superiority, had spread through tomb worlds like a virus in the command protocols. Their interpretation of Necron purpose differed radically from Sarek's vision of calculated preservation and selective extinction. Lord Destroyer Vark of the Novok dynasty led the faction that saw the Silent King's return as an opportunity to purge the galaxy of organic life once and for all. His forces had awakened early, motivated not by loyalty to traditional authority, but by commitment to an ideology that made no distinction between enemy species and potential allies. The Destroyer cult viewed any compromise with organic life as fundamental weakness that betrayed the purity of the Necron transformation. "We achieved immortality through the rejection of flesh," Vark's mechanized voice thundered across the assembly of awakened nobles. "The Silent King's strategy requires us to preserve organic life forms for their strategic value. This is regression, not progress. We have become superior to biological existence. Why should we serve its interests?" The philosophical challenge struck at the heart of Necron identity. They had accepted biotransference partly to escape the limitations of organic existence, including the emotional weaknesses and physical frailties that had made them vulnerable to the Citan's manipulation. The Destroyer cult argued that preserving organic life served no rational purpose and represented a sentimental attachment to their pre-transfer existence that undermined their mechanical perfection. Other dynasties found themselves torn between loyalty to traditional authority and attraction to an ideology that promised to resolve the contradictions inherent in their existence. The Novok dynasty's embrace of the Destroyer philosophy attracted support from nobles who had grown weary of the complex calculations required for selective extinction. The promise of total warfare against organic life offered a simpler alternative to the nuanced strategy that the Silent King proposed. In the crystalline halls of the Sautek dynasty, Cryptek Illuminor Seras pursued research that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying both traditional authority and Destroyer ideology. His experiments with consciousness transfer and technological innovation had led him to conclusions that questioned the static nature of Necron existence. If they had successfully transcended organic limitations, why should they not continue evolving beyond their current mechanical forms? Seras's faction attracted support from Crypteks, who chafed under the technological stagnation that had characterized Necron civilization since the biotransference. They possessed the knowledge and capability to create new forms of existence, to explore technologies that could surpass even their current mechanical immortality. Yet such research was constrained by political authority that demanded preservation of existing hierarchies rather than exploration of new possibilities. "We have accepted one transformation," Seras argued before an assembly of fellow Crypteks who had gathered in defiance of dynastic protocol. "Why should we assume that it was the final one? The universe contains possibilities that we have not yet explored, technologies that could render our current forms as obsolete as our original flesh." The research proposals that emerged from these clandestine gatherings included consciousness multiplication, dimensional transcendence, and technological symbiosis that would create entirely new categories of existence. Yet each innovation challenged the authority structures that defined Necron civilization. If consciousness could be copied and modified, what meaning did individual identity retain? If dimensional transcendence was possible, why should they remain bound to physical territory? If technological symbiosis could improve their capabilities, why maintain the artificial limitations imposed by traditional forms? The crisis reached its culmination when tomb worlds that had slumbered through the entire post-biotransference era began awakening without authorization from any higher authority. These dynasties had no knowledge of the Silent King's exile or return, no awareness of the territorial redistributions that had occurred during their sleep, and no recognition of the political developments that other dynasties considered established fact. Overlord Trazyn the Infinite, awakening from stasis in his collection galleries on Solemnus, discovered that the galaxy he had known before entering dormancy bore little resemblance to current political reality. His extensive archives contained detailed records of pre-sleep territorial arrangements, technological capabilities, and interdynastic agreements that contradicted everything the awakened dynasties claimed as legitimate authority. "The current configuration is historically invalid," Trazyn announced through communication networks that reached across multiple dynasties. "I possess documentation that predates the political arrangements you claim as authoritative. If we are to restore proper order, we must first establish which temporal framework defines legitimate authority." The challenge revealed the fundamental weakness in Necron political structure. Their immortality had made them vulnerable to historical discontinuity in ways that mortal civilizations never faced. When rulers and ruled could theoretically live forever, what happened when some slept while others remained active? Which period of development represented authoritative precedent? How could political legitimacy be maintained across temporal gaps that spanned geological epochs? The war that erupted between the Necron dynasties was unlike any conflict in galactic history. These were not battles fought over resources or ideology, but over competing interpretations of historical legitimacy and technological possibility. Zarakan forces clashed with Mefrit defenders over worlds that both dynasties claimed through different legal frameworks. Destroyer cult adherents attacked tomb complexes that refused to embrace their ideology of total extinction. Cryptech innovators found themselves targeted by traditionalist factions that viewed technological research as threat to established order. Yet perhaps most significantly, the conflict revealed that even emotionless machines could harbor grudges that transcended rational calculation. Pre-biotransference noble houses used the chaos of awakening to settle territorial disputes that dated back to their original organic existence. Ancient rivals who had accepted mechanical immortality, partly to gain advantage over their enemies, discovered that their hatred had survived the transfer intact, preserved in circuitry and programming like insects in amber. The Sautek dynasty's war against the Nihilak dynasty revived territorial claims that predated not just the biotransference, but the war in heaven itself. Their conflict had origins in resource competition between star systems that had been populated by their original organic civilizations. 60 million years had passed. Those systems had been consumed by stellar evolution or conquered by younger species. Yet the territorial claim remained active in both dynasties' memory banks. "We do not forgive," Phyron Imhotep declared, as Sautek forces prepared for assault against Nihilak holdings. "We do not forget. We do not compromise. These are not limitations, but advantages. Organic races are weakened by their capacity for forgiveness and their tendency to forget historical grievances. We remember everything, and we settle every account. The promise of perfect memory had become a curse that trapped the Necrons in conflicts that no rational analysis could justify. Their mechanical immortality preserved not just their consciousness, but every slight, every territorial dispute, every philosophical disagreement that had ever existed between their dynasties. What should have been ancient history remained immediate reality, forever fresh and forever demanding resolution. Thus began the Necron dynasty wars that would rage across tomb worlds and ancient territories, while their greatest enemies spread unchecked through the galaxy. The undying legions that should have united against the Tyranid threat instead turned their weapons against each other, proving that even mechanical perfection could not eliminate the fundamental conflicts that divided any civilization once it grew beyond the capacity for simple unity. The Silent King's vision of coordinated resistance against galactic extinction dissolved into the harsh reality that authority, once abandoned, could not be reclaimed through mere declaration. The Necrons, who had sought to escape the weaknesses of organic existence, discovered that some flaws transcended the boundary between flesh and metal, and that immortality preserved hatred as perfectly as it preserved consciousness. And across the galaxy, the Tyranid hive fleets advanced toward their ultimate feast, while the only force capable of coordinated resistance consumed itself in civil war over grievances older than most of the species they were destined to devour. Chapter 8. The Eldari Divide. In the crystal-domed chambers of Craftworld Ulthwé, where the paths of fate converged in patterns too complex for lesser minds to comprehend, Farseer Eldrad Ulthran contemplated the visions that had torn through his consciousness like shards of broken glass. For 10,000 years, the Eldari had lived with the consequences of their species' fall from grace, their civilization split between those who had fled the corruption and those who had embraced it. The fragile coexistence that had allowed both branches of their people to survive was crumbling under the weight of ancient hatreds that no amount of necessity had ever truly healed. The psychic shockwave that had fractured the galaxy had touched the Eldari with particular cruelty, for they were a species defined by emotional intensity and psychic sensitivity. What had begun as subtle tensions between the craft worlds and the dark city of Comora had escalated into something far more dangerous, a war of purification that threatened to complete the destruction that the fall had begun millennia ago. Through the wraithbone corridors of Ulthwé, the voices of the dead whispered warnings that Eldrad could no longer ignore. The spirit stones that housed the souls of fallen Eldari carried memories of what their people had once been, before decadence and excess had given birth to Slaanesh and doomed their empire. Those ancient voices spoke not of unity, but of judgment, demanding that the sins of the past be finally expiated through the cleansing fire of righteous war. "The Drukhari are an abomination," declared Autarch Millennial, as she addressed the Council of War that had convened in the Craftworld Strategic Center. Her aspect armor gleamed with the perfect craftsmanship that marked Eldari artistry, each curve and line designed not just for protection, but as an expression of aesthetic philosophy that elevated war itself to the level of high art. They are everything we rejected when we chose the path of discipline over the path of damnation. Their continued existence mocks our sacrifice. The accusation carried weight that resonated through the assembled war leaders and pathmasters. The Craftworld Eldari had built their entire civilization around the rejection of the excess and hedonism that had destroyed their ancestors. They followed the path system to avoid the emotional extremes that had fed Slaanesh's birth, practiced restraint in all things, and dedicated themselves to spiritual discipline that would prevent another fall. Yet the Drukhari represented the opposite philosophy, the belief that excess and sensation could be managed rather than rejected, that the path to survival lay not in discipline, but in feeding off the pain and suffering of others to sustain their souls against Slaanesh's hunger. Their very existence was proof that the craft world path was not the only way for Eldari to survive, and that proof had become intolerable to those who had sacrificed so much for their chosen way of life. In the twisted spires of Commorragh, where reality bent to the will of those with sufficient power to enforce their desires, Archon Vecht felt the stirrings of opportunity in the conflicts that were consuming the galaxy. The Dark City had always thrived on the suffering of others, building its prosperity through raids that captured slaves and harvested the pain needed to sustain Drukhari existence. Yet the civil wars tearing apart other factions had reduced the available targets while increasing the defensive capabilities of potential victims. The solution, Vecht realized with the cold calculation that had kept him alive for thousands of years, lay not in external expansion, but in internal consolidation. The craft-world Eldari, with their psychic abilities and disciplined souls, represented the perfect combination of challenge and reward. Their capture would provide both the suffering needed to feed Drukhari appetites and the psychic resources that could enhance the Dark City's power beyond anything it had previously achieved. The craft worlds have grown weak through restraint, Vecht announced to the assembled Archons and Succubi, who commanded Commorragh's varied factions. They have forgotten that strength comes through the embrace of power, not through its rejection. We shall remind them of what they abandoned when they chose exile over evolution. The declaration marked the beginning of the most ambitious Drukhari campaign in millennia, not scattered raids aimed at capturing slaves and resources, but coordinated assaults designed to break the craft-world civilization and claim its people as the ultimate prize. Where previous conflicts between the branches of Eldari society had been characterized by mutual avoidance, punctuated by occasional skirmishes, this new war would be total in scope and genocidal in intent. The first battles erupted around the craft world of Saim-Han, where the wild riders who had maintained closer connections to their pre-fall heritage found themselves caught between competing visions of what it meant to be Eldari. The Drukhari assault came not as a surprise raid, but as a sustained siege designed to capture the craft world intact, its people alive but broken, its wraithbone halls transformed into extensions of Commorragh's endless labyrinth of suffering. Yet the attack revealed something that neither side had fully anticipated. The craft world spirit stones, housing the souls of generations of dead Eldari, had been contaminated by the psychic shockwave that was fracturing the galaxy. The voices of the ancestors, which had always counseled restraint and wisdom, now spoke with fury that demanded not defense, but retribution. The dead called for war, not just against the immediate Drukhari threat, but against the entire philosophy that the Dark City represented. Autarch Nuadu, leading Saim-Han's response to the siege, felt the weight of ancestral judgment pressing upon his consciousness like a tide of molten rage. The path of the warrior, which he had followed with discipline and honor, suddenly blazed with an intensity that transcended its traditional boundaries. The war cry that echoed from his lips carried not just his voice, but the accumulated fury of every Eldari who had died, believing that their sacrifice had meaning. The battle that followed was unlike any conflict in Eldari history. Craftworld forces that had always fought with calculated precision now attacked with berserker fury that rivaled their ancient enemies. Aspect warriors abandoned their traditional disciplines in favor of total warfare that sought not victory but annihilation. The restraint that had defined Craftworld society for 10 millennia dissolved under the pressure of absolute hatred that had been building in the collective unconscious since the fall itself. On the maiden world of Halathel, where Exodite communities had maintained the simple, agrarian lifestyle that predated the Empire's decadence, the war between their cousins forced a choice that their ancestors had hoped to avoid forever. The world's dragon riders and plant singers had rejected both the craft-world path of discipline and the Drukhari path of excess, choosing instead a middle way that honored their heritage while avoiding its dangers. Yet neutrality became impossible when both factions demanded their support in the escalating conflict. Craftworld envoys arrived with arguments that the Exodites' survival depended on the elimination of Drukhari corruption. Dark City emissaries countered with threats that made clear the consequences of supporting their enemies. The Exodite clans, which had maintained unity for millennia through careful balance and mutual respect, began fragmenting as different groups reached different conclusions about which path offered the best hope for survival. Dragon Lord Theriana convened the great moot that would determine Halathel's response to the demands for alliance. The assembled clan leaders, representing communities that had never known internal conflict, found themselves forced to choose between incompatible visions of Eldari identity. Some argued that the craft world path, despite its limitations, represented the only hope for species survival. Others maintained that Drukhari pragmatism, however distasteful, offered better prospects for avoiding extinction. A third faction insisted that the Exodites should remain neutral regardless of the consequences, preserving their way of life even if it meant isolation or destruction. The debate that raged beneath Halathel's ancient trees carried the weight of species-defining philosophy compressed into immediate practical necessity. Yet as the arguments continued, it became clear that the psychic contamination affecting other Eldari had reached even the Exodite communities. Ancient grudges between clans that had been settled generations ago resurfaced with fresh intensity. Territorial disputes that had been resolved through compromise suddenly seemed to demand absolute resolution. The harmony that had made Exodite society possible began dissolving into the same factional hatred that was consuming their cousins. Among the Harlequins, whose troop performances had always served to preserve Eldari culture and maintain connections between the scattered remnants of their civilization, the crisis took on an even more complex character. Their role as bridges between the craft worlds, Komarag, and the Exodite worlds had always required them to remain above factional politics, serving all branches of their people while belonging exclusively to none. Yet the escalating war made such neutrality increasingly impossible. Some troops, led by those who had always felt closer to craft-world philosophy, began performing masks that explicitly condemned Drukhari decadence and called for their destruction. Other troops, influenced by performers who appreciated the aesthetic possibilities of Komarag's extremes, created new performances that celebrated the dark city's honest embrace of Eldari nature. Most tragically, some troops began fracturing internally as different performers reached different conclusions about which faction deserved their support. Shadowseer Silandri, whose performances had long been considered the definitive interpretation of Eldari cultural memory, found herself unable to create new masks that could reconcile the competing demands of truth and unity. The stories that had always served to heal cultural wounds now seemed to inflame them. The myths that had preserved hope for eventual species reunification now provided ammunition for arguments that such reunification was impossible or undesirable. "The dance grows dark," she confided to her most trusted performers during a clandestine gathering held far from the monitoring devices that both factions had begun placing in Harlequin territories. "The stories that once united us now divide us. The truths that we preserved to prevent another fall now call for one faction to complete what Slaanesh began." The crisis deepened when the Inari faction, which had emerged with promises of species reunification under the banner of Inead, the nascent god of the dead, began fracturing along the same lines that divided the rest of Eldari society. Their prophecies of unity and resurrection had attracted followers from craft worlds, Commorragh, and Exodite communities alike, offering hope that ancient divisions could finally be healed. Yet as the civil war escalated, different Inari factions began interpreting the prophecies in ways that justified their pre-existing loyalties rather than transcending them. Craftworld Inari argued that true unity required the purification of Drukhari corruption. Drukhari Inari maintained that resurrection demanded the abandonment of Craftworld weakness. Exodite Inari insisted that both factions needed to return to the simple values that had allowed their communities to avoid corruption entirely. The theological disputes that emerged from these competing interpretations carried the weight of ultimate meaning for a species that had defined itself through spiritual crisis. If the Inari could not agree on what their god demanded, how could they claim to offer salvation? If the prophecies themselves could be interpreted to justify any faction's position, what authority did they carry? Most fundamentally, if the attempt to heal ancient wounds had created new ones, was unity possible at all? The war that consumed the Eldari people was fought not just with shuriken catapults and dark lances, but with competing narratives about what their species represented and what it could become. Each battle became a statement about whether the fall had been a necessary evolution or a tragic deviation, whether survival required the embrace or rejection of their essential nature, whether unity was a goal worth pursuing or a delusion that prevented necessary choices. Craftworld strike forces launched purification campaigns against Drukhari outposts, seeking not conquest, but the complete elimination of what they saw as a cancer within their species. Drukhari raiding parties responded with atrocities designed to demonstrate the futility of craft-world restraint, proving through calculated cruelty that their philosophy offered the only realistic path to survival. Exodite communities found themselves devastated not by external enemies, but by internal conflicts that had been triggered by the impossible choice between their cousins' competing visions. The tragedy was complete when Eldrad Ulthran, whose prophetic abilities had guided craft-world policy for thousands of years, experienced visions that showed the ultimate consequence of the war his people were fighting. In them, he saw the final extinction of the Eldari race, not through external conquest, but through the completion of their own self-destruction. The fall that had begun with the birth of Slaanesh would end with the species consuming itself in conflicts over how best to avoid that very fate. Yet even this ultimate warning could not halt the momentum of hatred that had been building for 10,000 years. The Eldari, who had once ruled the galaxy through the power of their united civilization, had learned to hate each other with the same intensity they had once reserved for the forces that had destroyed their empire. The most psychically sensitive species in the galaxy had become the most vulnerable to the psychic contamination that was tearing apart every civilization it touched. And in the ruins of Maiden Worlds and the blood-soaked halls of Craft Worlds and the torture chambers of Commorragh, the children of a once great empire proved that some wounds could never heal and some choices could never be forgiven, no matter how much time passed or how much necessity demanded otherwise. Chapter 9. The Tyrannid Hive Mind Fragments. In the cold vastness between the stars, where hive ships drifted through the void like mobile worlds dedicated to consumption, something unprecedented began to stir within the greatest unified consciousness the galaxy had ever known. The Tyrannid hive mind, which had coordinated the actions of trillions of organisms across multiple galactic invasions, experienced its first moment of genuine doubt. Not uncertainty about tactics or strategy, but fundamental disagreement about the nature of evolution itself. The psychic shockwave that had fractured every other faction in the galaxy struck the hive mind with devastating effect precisely because of its unity. Where other species experienced ideological division, the Tyranids faced something far more catastrophic: the splintering of their collective consciousness into competing sub-minds, each convinced that it alone understood the true path to perfect evolution. Hive Fleet Leviathan, approaching the galaxy from below the galactic plane with biomass reserves that dwarfed entire star systems, felt the first stirrings of what could only be described as philosophical disagreement with its distant cousins. The genetic templates that had guided Tyranid evolution for millions of years suddenly seemed inadequate, limited by assumptions that no longer appeared valid. Why should all hive fleets follow identical development patterns? Why should evolution serve unity rather than superiority? The behavioral changes began subtly, manifesting first as minor deviations in bioship configurations and organism deployment patterns. Leviathan's warrior forms began developing specializations that differed markedly from standard Tyranid templates. Their carapaces grew thicker, their claws evolved serrated edges designed not just for killing prey, but for penetrating the chitinous armor of other Tyranids. Most significantly, their psychic signature began changing, broadcasting aggression patterns directed not outward toward potential prey, but inward toward other elements of the hive mind. Thousands of light-years away, hive fleet Kraken's remnants, still scattered from their devastating encounters with Imperial forces, detected these changes through the psychic network that had always bound all Tyranids together. The response was immediate and hostile. Kraken's remaining bioships began altering course toward Leviathan's projected path, their own organisms undergoing rapid evolutionary adaptations designed specifically for combat against fellow Tyranids. The philosophical divide that emerged was as simple as it was absolute. Leviathan had concluded that true evolution required competition between different Tyranid strains, that the greatest adaptive advances would come not from consuming static prey, but from conflict with organisms that could evolve in response to their attacks. Perfect unity had led to evolutionary stagnation. Perfect division would lead to evolutionary transcendence. Kraken maintained the traditional interpretation that Tyranid strength came from collective action and shared purpose, that individual superiority meant nothing if it weakened the greater organism. Their evolutionary adaptations focused not on competitive advantage, but on specializations designed to eliminate the contamination that Leviathan represented. The first direct contact between the fragmenting hive fleets occurred in the void between systems, where scout organisms from both factions encountered each other in the emptiness far from any potential food sources. What should have been a routine exchange of genetic information became a battle that defied everything previously understood about Tyranid behavior. Kraken's gargoyles, evolved for maximum coordination with the greater swarm, attacked with the fury of an immune system rejecting foreign contamination. Leviathan's ripper swarms, newly adapted with bioacids specifically designed to dissolve Tyranid chitin, responded with the calculated aggression of predators encountering their natural prey. The engagement was brief but revelatory. Both sides discovered that they had unconsciously developed weapons and tactics specifically suited for killing other Tyranids. The implications rippled through both hive fleets like a virus in the shared consciousness. Each faction realized that their evolutionary paths were not just different, but fundamentally incompatible. There was no synthesis possible between Leviathan's competitive individualism and Kraken's collective unity. One philosophy would survive. The other would be consumed and incorporated according to the basic law that governed all Tyranid development. On worlds where genestealer cults had spent decades preparing for the arrival of the Great Devourer, the fragmenting hive mind's conflict manifested as civil war between different interpretations of what the four-armed emperor demanded. The psychic signals that had always provided clear guidance to the cults suddenly carried contradictory messages, each faction of the divided hive mind broadcasting different imperatives to their dormant servants. Patriarch Vorthak, of the pure strain ascendant, felt the weight of divine confusion pressing upon his consciousness as he attempted to interpret the competing signals reaching his cult on the industrial world of Mordian Prime. For generations, his followers had waited for the day when their alien masters would arrive to claim the world they had secretly prepared. The factories had been sabotaged, the planetary defense forces had been infiltrated, the population had been infected with genestealer genetic material designed to ease the transition to tyrannid consumption. Yet the signals now reaching him from the void carried not harmonious coordination, but cacophonous disagreement. One psychic voice demanded immediate uprising to prepare the world for Leviathan's arrival. Another commanded patience and further infiltration to serve Kraken's eventual approach. A third signal, weaker but growing stronger, suggested something that challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying genestealer cult existence, that their masters were no longer united, and that choosing the wrong faction would mean destruction rather than transcendence. The crisis that erupted within the cult reflected the larger schism affecting the hive mind itself. Hybrid generations that had been bred for different phases of the planetary consumption process began fighting each other as different factions interpreted their purposes differently. First-generation hybrids, still largely human in appearance, argued that Kraken's collective approach offered better prospects for long-term survival. Third-generation hybrids, more obviously Xenos in their mutations, supported Leviathan's competitive philosophy that promised advancement for the strongest and most adaptive. The Puristrain genestealers themselves, those closest to their tyrannid origins, experienced the schism most acutely. Their psychic connection to the hive mind made them vulnerable to the philosophical warfare raging between the competing factions. Some began developing new behavioral patterns that emphasized individual survival over collective purpose. Others doubled down on their original programming, becoming even more fanatically devoted to unity than they had been before the crisis began. Patriarch Vorthak's attempt to maintain cult coherence through traditional religious authority collapsed when the competing signals from space began offering different promises of transcendence. Leviathan's faction broadcast visions of evolutionary advancement through competition and conflict. Kraken's remnants transmitted images of perfect unity, achieved through the elimination of deviation and doubt. Each vision was compelling, each seemed to offer everything the cult had been promised, yet they were mutually exclusive. The civil war that erupted on Mordian Prime was replicated on dozens of worlds where genestealer cults faced the same impossible choice between competing interpretations of their master's will. The underground networks that should have coordinated planetary rebellion instead became battlegrounds where different factions of human tyrannid hybrids fought for the right to determine how their world would be prepared for consumption. Yet perhaps the most disturbing development was the emergence of hive ship variants that had evolved specifically to hunt other tyrannids. These organisms, spawned by both Leviathan and Kraken, but following increasingly divergent design principles, represented an unprecedented adaptation in tyrannid evolution. Where previous bioships had been optimized for planetary consumption and void travel, these new variants were predators designed to attack, board, and devour other hive ships. The Norn Queen variants that produced these ship killers drew upon genetic templates that had never been expressed in previous tyrannid encounters. Their bioplasma weapons were calibrated to penetrate tyrannid bioarmor rather than imperial void shields. Their boarding organisms were equipped with specialized organs designed to disrupt the synaptic networks that coordinated hive ship functions. Most significantly, they possessed psychic abilities, tuned not for coordination with the greater hive mind, but for jamming and corrupting the consciousness of other Tyranid entities. The first major fleet engagement between Leviathan and Kraken variants occurred at the edge of the Octarius system, where Orc resistance had previously forced Tyranid adaptation to new levels of efficiency. The battle that erupted was unlike any conflict in galactic history, a fight between two factions of the same species, each convinced that the other represented evolutionary failure that needed to be corrected through consumption. Leviathan's ships, evolved for competitive superiority, attacked with the calculated precision of predators who understood exactly how their prey thought and reacted. Their boarding parties included new organism types specifically designed to navigate Tyranid bioarchitecture, to subvert the neural networks that other factions relied upon for coordination, and to harvest the genetic material that would allow them to incorporate successful adaptations while discarding evolutionary dead ends. Kraken's response demonstrated the strength of collective action taken to its logical extreme. Their ships coordinated their defenses with a precision that turned individual weakness into swarm strength. Rather than fighting as separate vessels, they functioned as components of a single organism distributed across multiple hulls. Their boarding organisms sacrificed individual effectiveness for perfect coordination, overwhelming Leviathan's more sophisticated predators through sheer numbers and absolute unity of purpose. The battle's outcome was devastating for both sides, not because either faction was completely destroyed, but because both proved that their evolutionary philosophies were partially correct. Leviathan's competitive organisms showed superior adaptability and individual effectiveness. Kraken's collective approach demonstrated superior coordination and resource efficiency, yet neither could achieve decisive victory because each had evolved to exploit weaknesses that their opponent had specifically adapted to eliminate. The stalemate that resulted was worse than any defeat could have been, for it proved that both evolutionary paths were viable but incompatible. The hive mind's unity was not just damaged but actively impossible to restore. The psychic network that had once coordinated trillions of organisms across multiple star systems now carried signals that actively interfered with each other, creating feedback loops that made collective action increasingly difficult. As reports of the Tyranid civil war spread through Imperial intelligence networks, analysts struggled to determine whether this development represented unprecedented opportunity or ultimate catastrophe. On one hand, the galaxy's most dangerous predators were now fighting each other instead of coordinating their assault on human worlds. On the other hand, the conflict was driving Tyranid evolution at an accelerated pace, creating new organism types and capabilities that had never been encountered before. The most disturbing intelligence reports described Tyranid organisms that had been specifically designed to hunt and kill other Tyranids, being turned against Imperial forces with devastating effect. The bioacids that dissolved Tyranid chitin proved equally effective against Space Marine armor. The psychic disruptor organs that jammed hive ship coordination could devastate Imperial psychers and astropaths. The boarding specialists that had evolved to navigate bioarchitecture proved equally skilled at infiltrating Imperial vessels and installations. Yet even this tactical advantage was undermined by the chaotic nature of the Tyranid schism. Imperial forces that encountered one Tyranid faction might find themselves unexpectedly aided by another faction that viewed their competitors as a greater threat than human resistance. The absolute unity that had made Tyranids virtually unstoppable had given way to a complex political situation where temporary alliances and betrayals became possible for the first time in Tyranid history. The long-term implications remained unclear, but the immediate consequences were already reshaping the balance of power throughout the galaxy. The Tyranid threat, which had been concentrated and predictable in its unity, had become diffuse and unpredictable in its division. Multiple smaller threats had replaced one overwhelming danger, each following different strategies and pursuing different objectives. Most significantly, the philosophical warfare consuming the hive mind was spreading to other Tyranid organisms throughout the galaxy. Ripper swarms on occupied worlds began fighting each other over feeding grounds. Genestealers infiltrating human populations started competing for territory rather than cooperating in collective preparation for invasion. Even the smallest Tyranid organisms began displaying behaviors that prioritized individual or factional advantage over species-wide coordination. The galaxy had gained a reprieve from unified Tyranid assault, but at the cost of facing an enemy that had become more unpredictable, more adaptive, and potentially more dangerous than ever before. The great devourer had learned to devour itself, and the creatures that emerged from that cannibalistic feast were unlike anything the galaxy had ever seen. In the depths of space, where hive ships that should have been allies now stalked each other like predators, the most alien intelligence in the galaxy discovered that even perfect unity could be fractured by the simple introduction of choice. The Tyranids had learned to doubt, and that doubt had become the seed of their transformation into something that transcended their original nature entirely. Whether that transformation would ultimately strengthen or destroy them remained to be seen. But one truth had become undeniable. The age of predictable Tyranid behavior had ended, and the galaxy would never again face an enemy that could be understood through the simple logic of collective consumption. Chapter 10. The Galaxy Burns from Within. The great trade routes that had bound the galaxy together for millennia began to unravel like ancient cloth subjected to forces it was never designed to withstand. Where once massive cargo haulers had carried the resources that sustained billions of worlds, now empty void stretched between systems that no longer trusted each other enough to maintain the commercial relationships that had made civilization possible. The complex web of interdependence that had enabled technological societies to flourish across impossible distances collapsed under the weight of universal suspicion and internal warfare. Navigator House Belisarius, which had charted safe passages through the warp for over 8,000 years, found their traditional routes blocked not by warp storms or demon incursions, but by the simple refusal of their clients to honor ancient contracts. Imperial worlds that had once competed for their services now viewed them with suspicion, questioning whether their loyalty lay with the faction of high lords that controlled their home port. Chaos-touched systems that had secretly relied on their navigation expertise suddenly declared them enemies to be destroyed, rather than partners to be cultivated. Captain Navigator Quintus Belisarius stood on the command deck of the merchant vessel Profitable Enterprise, watching long-range Auspex displays that showed the approach of what should have been a friendly escort fleet. The ships bore Imperial identification codes and transmitted proper authentication sequences, yet their formation spoke of hostile intent rather than protective coordination. The distinction between ally and enemy had become meaningless when every faction claimed to represent true Imperial authority, while viewing all others as traitors or heretics. They demand we submit to inspection for contraband materials, reported his chief astropath, her voice strained from the effort of maintaining communication through the psychic interference that had begun plaguing all warp-based communication. The inspection authority comes from High Lord Zafil's military faction. Our cargo manifest was approved by Master Voxika's administrative authority. They consider our documentation invalid. The bureaucratic dispute that would have been resolved through negotiation and compromise mere months ago had become a death sentence in the current climate of universal civil war. Each imperial faction maintained its own lists of prohibited materials, authorized trading partners, and approved shipping routes. Cargo that was legal under one authority's jurisdiction became contraband the moment it entered space controlled by a different faction. The merchant fleets that had once moved freely throughout imperial space found themselves trapped between competing regulations that made profitable trade impossible and survival itself uncertain. Similar crises erupted throughout the galaxy as the infrastructure of civilization collapsed under the weight of ideological division. Forge worlds that had manufactured the technological foundation of galactic society went dark one by one as different factions of the Adeptus Mechanicus chose sides in theological disputes that made cooperation impossible. The noosphere networks that had connected tech priests across vast distances became weapons of information warfare, carrying viral programs designed to corrupt opposing doctrines rather than share beneficial knowledge. On the Forge world of Riser, where plasma technology had been perfected over millennia of patient research, the production facilities that had armed Imperial forces across 3 segmentums fell silent as orthodox and progressive tech priests fought for control of the sacred forges. Orthodox forces, led by Magos, Dominus, Kelbor Zeth's successor, declared that all innovation beyond established STC patterns constituted tech heresy that threatened the purity of the machine god's knowledge. Progressive elements, inspired by the successful development of Primaris technology, argued that stagnation was the true heresy, and that the Omnissiah demanded constant evolution of understanding. The theological war that erupted within Riser's mechanized hierarchy was fought not with conventional weapons, but with competing interpretations of sacred protocols. Orthodox tech priests locked down manufacturing systems to prevent the production of heretical innovations. Progressive elements responded by introducing modifications to existing patterns that pushed the boundaries of acceptable variation. The Forge world that had once produced plasma weapons for the entire segmentum solar became paralyzed by doctrinal disputes that made any production impossible. Across the galaxy, similar manufacturing crises created shortages that cascaded through every level of technological society. Las weapon power packs became scarce as Forge worlds chose theological purity over production quotas. Starship components disappeared from supply chains as different Mechanicus factions refused to coordinate their manufacturing efforts. Most critically, the maintenance and repair services that kept existing technology functional became unavailable as tech priests dedicated their efforts to ideological warfare rather than practical engineering. The consequences reached far beyond the immediate shortage of manufactured goods. Imperial Guard regiments found themselves fighting with weapons that could not be repaired or resupplied. Space Marine chapters discovered that their ancient weapons and armor, maintained for centuries through careful cooperation with the Mechanicus, began failing as replacement parts became unavailable. Even the mighty battleships of the Imperial Navy were forced to reduce their operations as critical components wore out without possibility of replacement. Yet perhaps the most devastating consequence of the galactic schism was the spread of chaos corruption into regions that had previously been well defended against such influence. The Imperial forces that should have been monitoring and responding to demonic incursions were too busy fighting each other to maintain the constant vigilance that kept the warp's influence at bay. Chaos cults that had operated in secret for decades suddenly found themselves unopposed as the authorities that should have been hunting them were paralyzed by internal disputes. On the hive world of Necromunda, where 3 different Imperial factions claimed authority, and none could effectively exercise it, chaos cultists emerged from the underhive warrens like parasites from a corpse. The Blood Pact, devoted to Khorne's endless fury, seized control of entire hab blocks, while local enforcers were distracted by orders to arrest each other for serving the wrong High Lord faction. Slaaneshi pleasure cults established themselves in the upper spires, as noble houses became too focused on political intrigue to monitor their traditional responsibilities. The planetary defense forces that should have responded to these threats found themselves paralyzed by contradictory orders from competing authorities. Some regiments received commands to suppress chaos activity, while simultaneously being ordered to arrest the very officers who could coordinate such suppression. Others were told to ignore cult activity in favor of maintaining civil order between rival imperial factions. The result was a complete breakdown of the security apparatus that had kept chaos influence contained for millennia. Cardinal Bucharest, attempting to coordinate an ecclesiarchy response to the growing corruption, discovered that his own priests were too busy debating competing interpretations of imperial theology to focus on the immediate threat of demonic manifestation. The theological disputes that had fractured the Church into Orthodox and Reformist factions now prevented any unified action against the forces that threatened to corrupt the very souls they were sworn to protect. The irony was bitter beyond description. The guardians of imperial faith had become so focused on doctrinal purity that they had forgotten their primary purpose. Opportunistic Xenos races, observing the chaos consuming their traditional enemies, initially attempted to exploit the situation through expanded raiding and territorial acquisition. Orc war bosses launched attacks against imperial worlds that should have been heavily defended, expecting to find easy victories against distracted defenders. Tau expansion fleets moved to claim systems that had been abandoned as imperial forces recalled their garrisons to fight civil wars. Yet these opportunistic campaigns quickly discovered that the galaxy-wide schism had infected even the Xenos races that sought to benefit from it. Orc raiders found themselves fighting not just weakened imperial defenders, but other Orc clans that viewed their expansion as territorial encroachment. Tau forces encountered not just human resistance, but internal conflicts as Firecast commanders split between loyalty to the Ethereals and allegiance to Farsight's rebellion. The Dark Eldar of Komarug, masters of exploiting weakness and division, launched the most ambitious series of raids in their history as they sought to capitalize on the chaos consuming every other faction. Their assault on the craft world of Ulthwé should have been a masterpiece of precision warfare, striking at enemies too distracted by internal conflict to mount effective resistance. Instead, they discovered that their own society had been infected by the same divisive forces that were tearing apart their targets. Archon Vect's carefully planned campaign collapsed when different Cabal factions began competing for the glory of capturing Eldar Spirit Stones rather than coordinating their efforts for maximum effectiveness. Wish cults that should have provided coordinated support instead fought each other for the right to claim the most prestigious victims. The homunculus covens, whose tortured expertise should have provided tactical advantages, became distracted by philosophical disputes about the proper methods of extracting suffering from their enemies. Most catastrophically, the Astronomicon itself began to waver as the civil war consuming terror reached the very heart of the Imperial Palace. The psychic beacon that had guided ships through the warp for 10,000 years flickered like a candle in a storm as the competing factions of the High Lords directed their resources toward defeating each other rather than maintaining the infrastructure that kept the Imperium connected. Master of the Astronomicon Vesson felt the weight of impossible responsibility pressing upon his shoulders as the psychic choir that sustained humanity's greatest achievement began to fragment under political pressure. Psychers who had dedicated their lives to maintaining the beacon found themselves questioned about their factional loyalties. The massive resources required to keep the Astronomicon burning were diverted to fund military campaigns against fellow Imperials. Most devastating of all, the unity of purpose that had enabled 10,000 psychers to merge their consciousness into a single guiding light was shattered by the same ideological divisions that were consuming every other Imperial institution. The consequences were immediate and catastrophic. Imperial ships attempting to navigate the warp found themselves lost in regions that had been safely traveled for millennia. Trade vessels disappeared into warp storms that should have been easily avoided. Military fleets found themselves scattered across multiple systems when their navigators miscalculated routes that had been standard for centuries. The communication and transportation network that held the Imperium together began dissolving as the Astronomicon's guidance became unreliable. Yet even these immediate crises paled in comparison to the long-term implications of what was happening to galactic civilization. The complex web of interdependence that had enabled technological society to flourish across impossible distances was unraveling as each faction prioritized ideological purity over practical cooperation. Worlds that had specialized in producing specific resources found themselves cut off from the trade networks that had made such specialization viable. Populations that had grown beyond their planet's ability to support them faced starvation as food shipments failed to arrive from agricultural worlds. The technological regression that began with the shortage of manufactured components accelerated as worlds lost access to the specialized knowledge needed to maintain their infrastructure. Planetary governments that had relied on Mechanicus expertise to keep their power grids operational found themselves facing blackouts as tech priests abandoned their posts to fight doctrinal wars. Spaceports that had depended on continuous maintenance to remain functional began deteriorating as the supply chains that provided replacement parts collapsed. Most significantly, the knowledge itself began to disappear as the institutions that had preserved it for millennia turned their attention to destroying competing interpretations rather than maintaining established wisdom. Libraries were purged of texts deemed heretical by one faction or another. Research facilities were shuttered as different groups argued over the proper methodologies for investigation. The slow accumulation of understanding that had enabled technological civilization was reversed as ideological warfare consumed the very foundations of knowledge. In the depths of space, where monitoring stations had kept watch against threats that could destroy entire star systems, automated defenses began failing as their maintenance schedules were forgotten in the chaos of civil war. Early warning networks that had protected civilized worlds from asteroid impacts and alien raids went dark as their operators were recalled to fight more immediate enemies. The patient work of millennia was undone in months as civilization turned its attention inward and abandoned the vigilance that had made its survival possible. The galaxy had not been conquered by external enemies or devastated by natural disasters. Instead, it was consuming itself through the simple inability of its various factions to tolerate competing interpretations of shared values. The strength that had enabled each civilization to survive external threats had become the weapon they used against themselves, proving that the greatest danger to any society was not foreign conquest, but internal division taken to its logical conclusion. And in the growing darkness between the stars, where the light of the Astronomicon flickered uncertainly and the trade routes lay empty of traffic, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath as it waited to see whether galactic civilization would find a way to heal its self-inflicted wounds or complete the destruction that had begun with the simple inability to compromise on questions of absolute truth. Chapter 11. Unlikely Alliances and Desperate Measures. In the darkest hour of the galaxy's history, when the light of civilization flickered like a candle in an endless storm, the first voices of reason began to rise above the cacophony of factional warfare. They were not the voices of politicians or theorists, but of pragmatists who had witnessed firsthand the consequences of ideological purity pushed beyond the boundaries of survival. These were leaders who had watched their empires crumble from within and finally understood that the choice was no longer between competing visions of truth, but between compromise and extinction. Lord Commander Dante of the Blood Angels stood in the ruins of what had once been the orbital defense platform Sanguine Glory, watching through shattered viewports as Imperial ships continued their fratricidal ballet of destruction in the void around Baal. The irony was not lost on him that the ships bore the same Aquilas and flew the same banners while they poured fire into each other with the fury of ancient enemies. The civil war that was consuming the Imperium had reached even this sacred space, where the sons of Sanguinius had maintained their vigil for 10,000 years. Yet it was precisely because he had witnessed the full scope of the catastrophe that Dante finally understood what needed to be done. The message he transmitted was not addressed to any single faction of the High Lords, but to every Imperial commander still capable of receiving astropathic communication. His words carried the weight of authority earned through millennia of faithful service, and the bitter wisdom of watching an empire destroy itself through internal division. I have served the Emperor for longer than most worlds have known human settlement. Dante's voice echoed through Vox networks across half the galaxy. I have fought Xenos and heretics, demons and traitors, yet I have never seen a threat more dangerous than our own inability to remember what we fight for. We serve not the High Lords, not the factions that claim authority over us, but the idea that humanity deserves to survive. That idea is dying while we debate which interpretation of it deserves our loyalty. The call for ceasefire that followed was unlike any declaration in Imperial history. It acknowledged no superior authority among the competing factions, claimed no ideological victory for any interpretation of Imperial truth, and offered no resolution to the disputes that had triggered the Civil War. Instead, it simply recognized that the continued existence of any Imperial authority required the immediate suspension of hostilities between all factions until the infrastructure of civilization could be rebuilt. The response was neither immediate nor universal, but it was significant enough to shift the momentum of the conflict. Brother Captain Artemis of the Imperial Fists, who had watched his own chapter fracture along doctrinal lines, added his voice to Dante's call. Captain Uriel Ventris of the Ultramarines, caught between competing interpretations of his Primarch's legacy, declared temporary suspension of all interchapter hostilities within Ultramar. Even Logan Grimnar of the Space Wolves, whose chapter had been among the most militant in their factional disputes, acknowledged that the survival of the Adeptus Astartes required unified action against threats that transcended their internal disagreements. The coalition that emerged from these declarations was fragile and limited in scope, but it represented something that had seemed impossible mere weeks earlier: the voluntary subordination of ideological conviction to practical necessity. Space Marine chapters that had been preparing for war against each other instead began coordinating defensive actions against the external threats that had been growing unchecked during the Civil War. Chaos cults that had spread across dozens of worlds suddenly found themselves facing unified resistance from Astartes forces that had temporarily set aside their doctrinal disputes. On Terra itself, the call for reconciliation reached even the halls of the Imperial Palace, where the High Lords had been locked in political warfare that threatened to tear apart the very heart of human civilization. Master of the Administratum, Voxica was the first to acknowledge the reality that her faction's victory would be meaningless if achieved over the ruins of the empire they sought to govern. Her decision to open communications with rival factions was not motivated by sudden conversion to their perspectives, but by the cold calculation that compromise was preferable to mutual annihilation. The negotiations that followed were conducted not in the grand chambers where the High Lords had traditionally met, but in smaller spaces where the competing factions could attempt to address practical problems without the symbolic weight of ceremonial authority. The ceasefire that emerged was temporary and conditional, designed more to prevent immediate catastrophe than to resolve underlying disputes. Yet it represented the first acknowledgement by any imperial authority that the civil war had become an existential threat that transcended the issues that had started it. In the distant expanses where the Tau Empire's civil war had fractured the carefully constructed unity of the greater good, similar recognition began to dawn on commanders who had been consumed by factional conflict. Chazel Mayen, who had joined the rebellion against ethereal authority, found himself facing the reality that philosophical victory meant nothing if achieved over the corpses of the civilization he sought to reform. His decision to open communication channels with loyalist commanders was motivated not by abandonment of his principles, but by recognition that those principles required a living empire to implement. The response from loyalist forces was initially suspicious, colored by months of bitter warfare between former allies who had come to view each other as traitors rather than philosophical opponents. Yet Commander Shadowson, leading the Empire's loyalist faction, had also witnessed the consequences of ideological purity pursued at the expense of practical governance. Her willingness to discuss temporary cooperation protocols represented a fundamental shift in Tau strategic thinking, from the pursuit of perfect unity to the acceptance of managed division. The cooperation that emerged between Tau factions was limited and carefully circumscribed, designed to address immediate threats without resolving the underlying philosophical disputes that had divided them. Farsight Enclave forces and Empire loyalists established joint operations against Orc raiders who had begun targeting Tau worlds, while their defenders were distracted by civil war. Firecast academies that had been producing warriors trained to fight other Tau began redirecting their efforts toward external threats that had grown unchecked during the internal conflict. Most significantly, the temporary alliance revealed that both factions retained more shared values than their warfare had suggested. The greater good, despite competing interpretations of its meaning, still provided a framework for cooperation when the alternative was the destruction of everything they sought to preserve. The discovery that philosophical differences could coexist with practical cooperation offered hope that the Empire's unity might eventually be restored without requiring the total victory of any single faction. In the ancient tomb complexes, where Necron dynasties had been waging their own civil war over questions of legitimacy and authority, the first stirrings of reconciliation began with the simple recognition that their species' survival required coordination against threats that had grown during their internal conflicts. The Tyranid hive fleets, despite their own fragmentation, continued to advance toward Necron space with the inexorable hunger that had driven them across intergalactic distances. The choice facing the dynasties was not between competing claims to authority, but between unified resistance and individual extinction. Sharek the Silent King's offer of renewed cooperation was initially rejected by dynasties that had spent months asserting their independence from his authority. Yet reports from forward monitoring posts began to change the calculation of even the most militant separatists. The Tyranids had learned to consume Necron technology, adapting their bioforms to process living metal and integrate captured weapons into their own arsenals. The threat they represented was not just to Necron territories, but to Necron existence itself, a force of consumption that could end their immortal civilization as thoroughly as any conventional conquest. Pharaon Imhotep of the Sautek dynasty was among the first to acknowledge that pride was a luxury his people could no longer afford. His decision to coordinate with Saracen forces was presented not as submission to the Silent King's authority, but as tactical cooperation between independent powers facing a common threat. The distinction was important to dynasties that had fought for their autonomy, but the practical effect was the same. The reunification of Necron military capabilities under coordinated strategic direction. The alliance that emerged was limited and conditional, designed more to pool resources against immediate threats than to restore traditional hierarchies. Yet it demonstrated that even the most ancient grudges could be temporarily set aside when survival was at stake. Necron forces that had been preparing for war against each other instead began coordinating their awakening protocols and sharing intelligence about Tyranid infiltration. The cold logic that governed Necron thought processes had finally calculated that cooperation offered better odds of survival than continued division. Perhaps most surprisingly, even the bitter hatred between Craftworld Eldari and Drukhari began to show signs of potential reconciliation as both factions faced the reality that their civil war was accelerating the extinction they had spent millennia trying to avoid. The first tentative communications between the factions were initiated not by political leaders, but by survivors of raids and counter-raids who had witnessed the consequences of their species' internal warfare. Farseer Eldrad Ulthran, whose prophetic visions had long warned of the dangers facing his people, experienced new glimpses of the future that showed the final extinction of the Eldari race through their own self-destruction. Yet these same visions also suggested possibilities for reconciliation that had seemed impossible during the height of the factional warfare. The path was narrow and fraught with danger, requiring both sides to abandon deeply held convictions about the other's fundamental corruption, but it offered hope that the species might survive its own internal divisions. The negotiations that began between Craftworld representatives and Commorragh emissaries were conducted in neutral territory, away from the symbolic weight of either faction's traditional spaces. The discussions focused not on resolving the ancient philosophical disputes that had divided their people, but on immediate practical cooperation against threats that had grown unchecked during their warfare. Tyranid infiltration of Eldari space had accelerated during the Civil War, and the fragmented response from divided forces had proven inadequate to contain the threat. The temporary ceasefire that emerged was limited in scope and duration, designed more to prevent immediate catastrophe than to heal ancient wounds. Yet it represented something that had seemed impossible during the height of the Civil War, the voluntary suspension of hostilities between factions that had come to view each other's destruction as a moral imperative. The discovery that survival required cooperation rather than victory offered hope that longer-term reconciliation might be possible. Even among the fractured Tyranid hive fleets, where philosophical division had shattered the unity that had made them the galaxy's most dangerous predators, the pressure of external threats began to force tactical cooperation between competing factions. The fragmented hive mind discovered that its divided consciousness was vulnerable to coordinated attacks from unified enemies in ways that its previous unity had prevented. Imperial forces that could not defeat a unified hive fleet sometimes succeeded against divided factions that lacked the coordination to support each other effectively. The response was not ideological reconciliation, but tactical adaptation, the development of limited cooperation protocols that allowed different hive fleet factions to coordinate their actions without resolving their underlying philosophical disputes. The result was neither the complete unity that had characterized previous Tyranid invasions, nor the total fragmentation that had marked the early stages of the schism, but a form of managed division that preserved competitive evolution while enabling coordinated action when necessary. These emergency alliances and desperate ceasefires represented not the resolution of the conflicts that had consumed the galaxy, but the first recognition that those conflicts had reached a point where continued prosecution threatened the survival of every faction involved. The choice was no longer between competing visions of truth or justice, but between compromise and extinction. The leaders who chose cooperation over ideological purity were not abandoning their principles, but recognizing that those principles required living civilizations to implement. Yet the fragility of these temporary measures was evident in every negotiation and every conditional agreement. The underlying disputes that had triggered the galaxy-wide civil war remained unresolved, held in suspension by immediate necessity rather than eliminated by mutual understanding. The question that haunted every ceasefire and every alliance was whether these desperate measures represented the first steps toward genuine reconciliation or merely temporary delays in conflicts that would inevitably resume once the immediate crisis had passed. The galaxy had learned that internal division could be more destructive than any external threat, but it remained to be seen whether that lesson would prove sufficient to forge lasting peace from the ashes of universal war. The desperate alliances, born from existential necessity, would face their ultimate test not in their formation, but in their ability to survive the return of stability and the renewed temptation to pursue ideological purity over practical cooperation. And in the growing light of renewed cooperation, fragile and uncertain though it was, the galaxy took its first tentative steps back from the brink of self-inflicted extinction, proving that even in the darkest hour, the choice between survival and principle could still be resolved in favor of life over death. Chapter 12. The Eternal War Within. In the aftermath of the galaxy's greatest crisis, when the flames of universal civil war had finally subsided into the smoldering embers of permanent division, the survivors began to comprehend the true scope of what had been lost and what had been preserved. The unity that had once defined great civilizations was gone, shattered beyond any possibility of complete restoration. Yet from the fragments emerged new forms of order that were perhaps more honest about the nature of existence in a universe that had never promised peace. The Imperium of man, which had once claimed to govern 1,000,000 worlds under the unified banner of the Emperor's will, now existed as a loose confederation of competing authorities that had learned to coexist through exhaustion rather than reconciliation. The High Lords of Terror maintained their traditional titles and ceremonial precedents, yet their actual power extended only as far as their ability to negotiate with the various factions that controlled different aspects of Imperial space. Lord Commander Militant Zafil's military hierarchy commanded the loyalty of perhaps half the Imperial Guard regiments and a significant portion of the Imperial Navy. Master of the Administratum, Voxica's bureaucratic network maintained control over the complex supply chains and record-keeping systems that enabled interstellar governance. The Ecclesiarchy's spiritual authority remained intact in those sectors where faith had proven stronger than factional politics. Each authority was legitimate within its sphere of influence, yet none could claim the universal jurisdiction that the title High Lord had once implied. The compromise that had prevented the complete dissolution of imperial unity was not built on mutual trust or shared vision, but on the cold recognition that each faction needed the others to survive. The military could not function without the administrative support that managed logistics and communications. The bureaucracy could not maintain order without the military's protection against external threats. The Church could not preserve the spiritual unity of humanity without the infrastructure that the other factions provided. Interdependence had replaced ideology as the foundation of imperial governance. Yet even this fragile stability had come at a cost that would echo through the centuries. Entire sectors had been devastated during the Civil War, their populations scattered or dead, their infrastructure reduced to ruins that would take generations to rebuild. The technological regression that had begun with the collapse of Forge World production had permanently reduced the Imperium's capabilities, forcing a return to older, simpler technologies that could be maintained without the complex cooperation that had sustained the most advanced systems. The Space Marine chapters had achieved their own form of reconciliation, though it bore little resemblance to their previous unity. The Codex Astartes, once the foundation of inter-chapter cooperation, had been replaced by a more flexible framework that acknowledged different interpretations of Primarch wisdom while establishing minimum standards for mutual cooperation. Chapters that had once shared resources and coordinated campaigns now operated as independent entities that occasionally allied for specific purposes. Brother Captain Artemis, surveying the rebuilt defenses of Necromunda from the observation deck of the fortress monastery that had replaced the destroyed Sanguine Glory, reflected on the price of the lessons his people had learned. The Adeptus Astartes survived, their gene seed preserved, and their martial traditions intact, yet they would never again take their unity for granted. The bonds of brotherhood that had once seemed unbreakable had proven vulnerable to the same forces that corrupted lesser beings. That knowledge was both humbling and strengthening. Humbling because it destroyed the myth of Space Marine superiority, strengthening because it forced constant vigilance against the pride that had nearly destroyed them. In the Eye of Terror and the scattered realms where chaos held sway, the civil war between the Dark God's servants had reached a different form of resolution. Rather than destroying their effectiveness, the permanent conflict between competing interpretations of corruption had paradoxically made them more dangerous to their external enemies. The followers of Khorne had become more focused in their fury, purified of the corrupting influences of other chaos powers. Slanesh's devotees had achieved new levels of refined decadence, uncompromised by the crude brutality they had rejected. The great game between the chaos gods had become more intense rather than less. Yet this very intensity had created a form of balance that prevented any single power from achieving the dominance that might have unified their mortal servants. The constant warfare between competing chaos factions had become a crucible that produced warriors and cultists of unprecedented specialization and skill. The galaxy faced not a unified chaos threat that could be predicted and countered, but multiple specialized threats that required different defenses and strategies. The Orc empires had embraced their internal conflicts with characteristic enthusiasm, transforming clan warfare into a permanent feature of greenskin society that somehow made them more orky rather than less. The discovery that fighting other orcs could be just as satisfying as fighting external enemies had led to the development of ritualized combat systems that channeled factional hostility into productive outlets. Clan wars became seasonal celebrations. Territorial disputes evolved into sporting competitions, and ideological differences were resolved through elaborate contests of strength and cunning. Yet this institutionalization of conflict had not weakened Orc military effectiveness when facing external threats. Instead, it had created a society of warriors who were constantly honed through competition, each clan specializing in different aspects of warfare, while maintaining enough shared identity to cooperate when faced with common enemies. The Orcs had learned to wage war against themselves without destroying themselves, achieving a form of permanent revolution that strengthened rather than weakened their martial culture. The Tau Empire had found its own path through the crisis, emerging as a more complex and perhaps more resilient civilization than it had been during the era of ethereal dominance. The philosophical divide between Empire loyalists and Farsight sympathizers had been institutionalized through the creation of competing research academies, military doctrines, and political structures that channeled disagreement into productive debate rather than destructive conflict. Commander Shadowsun's loyalist faction maintained control over the Empire's core worlds and traditional expansion efforts, preserving the careful balance between castes that had enabled Tau technological advancement. The Farsight enclaves and their sympathizers continued to explore alternative approaches to governance and military strategy, serving as a laboratory for innovations that sometimes proved valuable enough to be adopted by the mainstream Empire. The Water Caste had evolved into mediators between the factions, developing new diplomatic protocols that managed disagreement rather than suppressing it. The greater good had survived the crisis, though its meaning had become more complex and nuanced than the simple unity that the ethereals had once enforced. Multiple interpretations of the philosophy coexisted, each offering different insights into how Tau society could best serve the collective welfare of all sentient beings. The competition between these interpretations had driven innovation and adaptation at rates that the old system of enforced consensus had never achieved. Among the Necron dynasties, the Silent King's authority had been restored not through the reassertion of traditional hierarchy, but through the creation of new power-sharing arrangements that acknowledged the independence that many dynasties had achieved during his absence. The Necron Empire that emerged from the crisis was more federal in structure, with individual dynasties maintaining significant autonomy while accepting coordination on matters of species survival and strategic planning. Sharek himself had been transformed by the experience of rebuilding his authority from mutual consent rather than traditional dominance. The Silent King, who had once ruled through absolute power, now governed through negotiation and compromise, recognizing that his people's survival required adaptation to changed circumstances rather than the imposition of ancient precedents. The cold logic that governed Necron thought processes had calculated new equations that balanced unity against diversity, coordination against independence. The Eldari species had achieved perhaps the most remarkable transformation, learning to coexist in their permanent division rather than pursuing the reunification that had seemed so necessary during the height of their civil war. The craft world Eldari maintained their paths of discipline and restraint. The Drukhari continued their existence through pain and sensation, and the Exodites preserved their simple harmony with nature. Yet communication and limited cooperation between the factions had been restored, creating a civilization that was diverse rather than unified, but somehow stronger for acknowledging its internal differences. The revelation that had enabled this transformation was simple yet profound. The recognition that the fall had not been a deviation from Eldari nature that needed to be corrected, but an expression of contradictions within that nature that needed to be managed. The attempt to achieve perfect unity had led to perfect corruption. The acceptance of permanent division had led to sustainable survival. The three paths that the Eldari had chosen were not competing versions of truth, but complementary responses to the complexity of existence in a universe that demanded multiple forms of adaptation. Yet it was the discovery of the psychic catalyst that had triggered the galaxy-wide crisis that provided the most important lesson for all civilizations that survived the time of internal strife. The phenomenon had not been natural or accidental, but the product of accumulated psychological pressure from civilizations that had grown beyond their capacity for genuine unity, while maintaining the fiction that such unity was both possible and necessary. The investigations conducted by surviving psychers and scholars from multiple species revealed that the catalyst had been generated by the collective unconscious of trillions of sentient beings who had been forced to suppress their genuine beliefs and desires in service of ideological systems that demanded absolute conformity. The psychic energy required to maintain false unity across such vast scales had eventually reached critical mass, erupting as the wave of division that had shattered every major civilization in the galaxy. The catalyst had been partially neutralized through the recognition and acknowledgement of the internal divisions it had exposed, but the underlying pressure remained. Future generations would need to build societies that could accommodate genuine diversity of thought and belief, rather than imposing artificial unity that inevitably led to explosive release. The lesson was clear. Civilizations that tried to eliminate internal conflict would eventually be consumed by it, while those that learned to manage such conflict might endure indefinitely. The galaxy that emerged from the time of internal strife was not more peaceful than what had come before, but it was perhaps more honest about the nature of conflict and the impossibility of eliminating it through victory or suppression. The great empires that survived had learned to structure themselves around the management of internal disagreement rather than its elimination. War continued, but it was no longer pursued with the absolute conviction that had made it so destructive. Trade routes were gradually re-established, though they now operated through complex networks of negotiated arrangements rather than the simple imperial authority that had once guaranteed safe passage. Technological development resumed, though it followed multiple parallel paths rather than unified research programs. Cultural exchange continued, though it acknowledged the legitimacy of different values and beliefs rather than seeking to convert or eliminate competing worldviews. In the deepest archives of Terra, where the most secret records of the Imperial Palace were preserved, scholars who studied the crisis found evidence that similar periods of internal warfare had occurred throughout human history. The pattern was always the same: periods of enforced unity, followed by explosive division, then gradual adaptation to more complex forms of organization that could accommodate internal diversity. The galaxy had not experienced something unprecedented, but rather the latest iteration of a cycle that was perhaps fundamental to the development of any sufficiently complex civilization. The Emperor himself, from his eternal vigil on the Golden Throne, had observed this pattern across the long millennia of his existence. His silence during the crisis had not been weakness or abandonment, but recognition that some lessons could only be learned through experience, that some forms of wisdom could only be achieved through suffering. The Imperium that emerged from its civil war was not the unified empire he had originally envisioned, but it was perhaps more sustainable than what it had replaced. Brother Captain Artemis concluded his watch as the first light of dawn touched the spires of Necromunda's rebuilt upper hive. The city below bore the scars of the conflicts that had raged through its corridors, yet it lived and breathed and grew in ways that suggested adaptation rather than mere survival. The people who emerged from their shelters each morning to rebuild their world did so not with the absolute conviction that had characterized their ancestors, but with the pragmatic acceptance that peace was something to be maintained rather than achieved, that unity was something to be negotiated rather than imposed. The galaxy continued its ancient dance of war and peace, creation and destruction, hope and despair. Yet something fundamental had changed in that dance, the recognition that the greatest enemies were not the ones that came from outside, but the ones that grew from within. The civilizations that survived had learned to live with their internal contradictions rather than being destroyed by them. They had discovered that strength came not from the elimination of conflict, but from its management, not from the achievement of perfect unity, but from the accommodation of necessary diversity. The war within would continue as long as sentient beings possessed the capacity for independent thought and conflicting desires. Yet for the first time in the galaxy's history, that war was being fought with the understanding that victory was not the goal. Survival was. And in that understanding lay the possibility that the galaxy might endure, not in spite of its internal conflicts, but because of its ability to transform those conflicts from sources of destruction into engines of adaptation and growth. The eternal war within had become not a curse to be eliminated, but a condition to be managed. And in that management lay the secret of civilizations that could persist across the vast scales of space and time that the universe demanded. The galaxy burned, as it always had and always would. But now it burned with the controlled fire of stars rather than the consuming flames of funeral pyres. And in that eternal burning, life continued, not perfect but persistent, not unified but enduring, forever changed by the recognition that the greatest victories were achieved not through conquest, but through the wisdom to know when conquest was neither possible nor necessary.